Hello, travelers of the night, and welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. These stories drift through the static, a signal that drowns out the noise of the waking world and guides you into slumber. Before the signal slips away, leave a trace. Tell me which part of the world you're listening from, so I know how far this broadcast reaches. And if the whispers keep you company, a like and a subscribe help keep the transmission alive. Now, close your eyes, relax. The broadcast begins. I've always been particular about routines. Every Tuesday and Friday morning at exactly 7:15, I wheel my garbage bin to the curb. Of the plastic wheels grinding against the concrete, with that familiar scraping sound. It's a sound I've grown to find oddly comforting, a small constant in an otherwise unpredictable world. My apartment building houses 12 units, but I rarely see my neighbors. We're all busy people, I suppose, coming and going at different hours, living our separate lives behind identical doors. The building itself is one of those unremarkable structures from the 70s, all bayed brick and narrow hallways that smell faintly of carpet cleaner and other people's cooking. Apartment 4B has been occupied for 3 years now, according to Mrs. Chen from the management office. But I've never once laid eyes on whoever lives there. No sounds through the thin walls, no footsteps in the hallway, no muffled television or music, just silence, as if the apartment exists in its own pocket of stillness. But every Tuesday and Friday, without fail, there's a garbage bag by the curb that wasn't there when I put mine out. I first noticed it on a particularly gray Tuesday in October. The morning air carried that sharp autumn scent of dying leaves and distant rain. As I wheeled my bin back from the curb after the collection, I glanced at the neat row of empty containers and saw it. A single black garbage bag, tied with the same twisted knot I always use, sitting exactly where my bin had been moments before. It struck me as odd, but not alarming. Perhaps someone had forgotten to put their trash out in time and left it for the next collection. These things happen. But then I started paying attention. The bag was always black, always the same size, always tied with that distinctive double, knot that I'd learned from my father years ago, a particular way of twisting the plastic that creates a kind of rosette pattern. Most people just tie a simple knot, but this method keeps the bag secure, even when it's heavy. I found myself walking more slowly past that spot, stealing glances at the mysterious bag. Through the thin plastic, I could make out familiar shapes. The corner of a cereal box, the curve of a milk jug, what looked like a small stack of papers. On the third Tuesday, curiosity got the better of me. I looked around the empty street, the morning still too early for most people to be awake, and carefully untied the bag. The plastic crinkled softly in my hands, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. Inside, I found things that made my breath catch in my throat. A cereal box. Honey Nut Cheerios, the same brand I'd thrown away the previous Friday. But not just the same brand. When I pulled it out with trembling fingers, I saw the same tear in the cardboard where I'd struggled with the inner bag, the same small stain from where I'd spilled coffee on it 3 days ago. Beneath that, a milk jug. The plastic was cracked in the exact same spot where I dropped it getting out of my car. The expiration date matched perfectly, October 15th, 2023. My hands shook as I dug deeper. A stack of bills and junk mail, the paper soft from coffee grounds and food residue. But there, on the top envelope, I saw my name. My full name, my address, printed in the same font as the envelope I'd thrown away last week. But that envelope was gone. I'd watched the garbage truck compact it along with everything else. I sat back on my heels, the morning air suddenly feeling too thin, too cold against my skin. Around me, the familiar street seemed to shift and blur at the edges, as if I was looking at it through water. Carefully, methodically, I went through everything in the bag. Each item was identical to something I'd discarded recently. Not similar, identical. The same scratches, the same wear patterns, the same small imperfections that make every used object unique. A yogurt container with the same fingerprint smudge on the rim. A toothpaste tube squeezed in exactly the same places. A receipt from the grocery store, dated 3 days ago, with my signature on the credit card slip. I retied the bag with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and left it where I'd found it. Back in my apartment, I stood at my kitchen window, watching through the thin curtains as the garbage truck arrived an hour later. I watched them load the bag into the compactor, watched it disappear into the mechanical darkness. That Friday, I decided to conduct an experiment. Before taking my garbage to the curb, I made careful note of everything I was throwing away. I wrote it all down in a small notebook. One empty pasta sauce jar with the label partially peeled off, revealing a triangle of sticky residue. One pizza box with a grease stain shaped roughly like Texas. 3 energy drink cans with the tabs pulled off and collected in the recycling bin separately. I even took photos with my phone, capturing the arrangement of items in the bag, the way the light fell across the label of the sauce jar, the exact dimensions of the grease stain. A Tuesday morning came with that same autumn chill, the same gray sky pressing down like a lid on the world. I waited by my window until the garbage truck had come and gone, then walked to the curb with steps that felt both too fast and too slow. The bag was there. Same size, same knot, same position where my bin had been. I untied it with the careful precision of a surgeon, my movements deliberate and slow. Inside, arranged in exactly the same order as my photos showed, were all the items I'd thrown away 4 days earlier. The pasta sauce jar with its triangle of sticky residue. The pizza box with the Texas-shaped stain. The 3 energy drink cans with their tabs missing. I pulled out my phone and compared the photos. Every detail matched perfectly. The angle of the peeled label, the color gradations in the grease stain, even the way the cans had settled against each other in the bag. But these items had been destroyed. I'd seen them fed into the compactor, watched them disappear into mechanical oblivion. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued with clockwork precision. Every piece of garbage I discarded would reappear in that mysterious bag, unchanged and unchanging, as if time itself was hiccuping, creating duplicates in some fold of reality I couldn't comprehend. I started varying my routine, trying to break the pattern. I threw away garbage on different days, at different times. I drove my trash to dumpsters across town. I even skipped a week entirely, generating no waste, eating only takeout that I disposed of at restaurants and coffee shops. Nothing changed. The bag appeared every Tuesday and Friday, always containing perfect copies of whatever I'd last thrown away, no matter when or where I'd disposed of it. I began losing sleep spending my nights standing at the window, watching the empty street, waiting to see who placed the bag. But I never saw anyone. The bag simply appeared, as if materializing from the darkness itself. During the day, I found myself studying my neighbors' faces in the lobby, searching for some sign of recognition, some hint that one of them knew what was happening. But they all looked through me with the polite indifference of city dwellers, their eyes sliding past as if I wasn't entirely there. Mrs. Chen in the management office confirmed that 4B was occupied, rent paid promptly every month by automatic bank transfer. But when I asked for a name, she suddenly looked confused, shuffling through her papers with increasing frustration. "I know I have the information here somewhere," she muttered, her accent thickening with stress. "The leases?" "Well, it must be in the other file. You know, I see that tenant all the time, but I can't quite... I'm sure they're very nice." The voice trailed off, her eyes taking on that same sliding quality I'd seen in others, as if something was preventing her from focusing on whatever information she was trying to access. I started keeping a detailed log, documenting every piece of garbage, every reappearance, every small deviation from the pattern. But there were no deviations. The system was perfect, unchanging, as reliable as gravity or the movement of the earth around the sun. Sometimes, lying awake at 3 a.m, I wondered if I was losing my mind. The thought would creep in like cold air through a crack in the window, making me question every memory, every observation. Maybe I was imagining the whole thing. Maybe the stress of my job, the isolation of city living, the endless repetition of daily routines had finally broken something crucial in my perception of reality. But then Tuesday would come, and Friday would come, and the bag would be there, solid and undeniable, filled with impossible duplicates of my discarded life. I tried following the garbage truck on its route, hoping to understand where the duplicates were coming from. But tracking a garbage truck through city traffic proved more difficult than I'd anticipated, and I always lost them in the maze of one-way streets and construction zones. 3 months in, I decided to throw away something unique, something that couldn't possibly have a duplicate. I wrote a letter to myself, documenting everything I'd experienced, sealing it in an envelope with a wax seal made from a candle I'd owned since college. The seal was imperfect, marked with a small air bubble that had formed when the wax was cooling. I also included a Polaroid photograph of myself holding that day's newspaper, the image slightly overexposed in that distinctive way that instant cameras produce. 4 days later, the letter was in the bag. Not a copy. The letter itself with the same imperfect wax seal, the same air bubble, the same slightly overexposed Polaroid. But I had sealed that envelope, watched it go into the garbage truck, seen it disappear. Yet here it was, returned to me like a message in a bottle washed up on an impossible shore. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, the letter was exactly as I'd written it, but at the bottom, in handwriting that was unmistakably mine, but somehow different, more careful, more deliberate, were 3 additional lines. "You're asking the wrong questions. The garbage isn't being duplicated. You are." I stared at those words until they seemed to move on the page, shifting and blurring like text seen through water. The handwriting was mine, but I had no memory of writing those lines. The pen ink was the same blue as the rest of the letter, but it seemed somehow newer, as if it had been added moments before rather than days ago. That night I couldn't sleep. I stood at my window watching the street, but also watching my reflection in the glass. In the dim light, my face looked unfamiliar, as if I was seeing a stranger who happened to share my features. I started questioning everything. When I made my morning coffee, I wondered if I was the same person who had gone to sleep the night before. When I looked in the mirror, I searched for some sign of continuity, some proof that I was the same consciousness that had awakened in this body every day for 32 years. The garbage continued to appear, but now each bag felt like evidence in a case I couldn't solve, proof of a reality I couldn't comprehend. Sometimes I think I see someone at the window of 4B, a shadow behind the curtains that could be a person standing very still. But when I look directly, there's nothing there, just the empty window of an apartment that might or might not be occupied by someone who might or might not be me. And every Tuesday, every Friday, I wheel my bin to the curb and listen to the familiar scraping of plastic wheels on concrete. The sound is still comforting, still constant. But now I wonder whose bin I'm wheeling, whose garbage I'm discarding, whose life I'm living. The bag will be there when the truck is gone. It's always there. And inside, I'll find pieces of a life that might be mine, or might belong to someone who shares my face, my memories, my particular way of tying a knot in a garbage bag. Someone who lives just close enough to me to cast the same shadow, but far enough away to remain forever unseen. Someone who throws away the exact same life, day after day, in an endless cycle of disposal and return. Someone who might be me, or might be what I become when I'm not looking. Story 2. The city breathes differently at 4 in the morning. The pulse slows, the tension eases, and the walls become canvases, waiting for someone like me to give them voice. I've been painting these streets for 7 years now, leaving my mark in the forgotten spaces between day and night, in the liminal hours when the city belongs to shadows and dreamers, and those of us who speak in colors instead of words. My name is Marcus, and I paint the truth that others can't see. At least, that's what I used to believe. My territory stretches across 3 neighborhoods in the old industrial district, where abandoned warehouses stand like concrete monuments to a more prosperous past. The walls here are vast and unguarded, perfect for the large, scale pieces that have become my signature. I work with spray cans mostly, but also brushes and markers, building up layers of color and meaning that transform blank surfaces into windows into alternate realities. The work is illegal, of course, but there's something pure about creating art that exists outside the boundaries of permission and commerce. Something honest about leaving your mark on a world that often seems designed to erase individual voices. I've developed a routine over the years. I scout locations during daylight hours, walking through the neighborhoods with my camera, taking note of wall conditions, foot traffic patterns, visibility from the street. Then I return in the early morning darkness, when the streets are empty except for the occasional patrol car or delivery truck. The abandoned textile factory on Morrison Street became my favorite canvas 3 months ago. The north-facing wall is massive, maybe 40 feet wide by 20 feet high, and positioned so that it catches the morning sun perfectly. It's visible from the main road, but set back far enough that I can work undisturbed for hours. My first piece, there was a sprawling urban landscape in shades of blue and silver, with tiny figures moving through geometric streets like blood cells through arteries. It took me 3 nights to complete, and when I finished, I felt that particular satisfaction that comes from translating a vision into reality. But when I returned the following week to start a new piece, I found something that stopped me cold. Someone had modified my work, not tagged over it or defaced it, modified it. With delicate brushstrokes and careful attention to my color palette, someone had added details that integrated seamlessly with my original design. A few windows that had been dark now glowed with warm yellow light. Some of the tiny figures had been given more defined features. Small touches that brought them to life without disrupting the overall composition. The additions were beautiful, tasteful, and completely unauthorized. My first reaction was anger. In the graffiti community, there are unspoken rules about respecting other artists' work. You don't paint over someone else's piece without permission, and you certainly don't modify it. But as I studied the changes more closely, my anger gave way to curiosity. The additions were too skillful to be vandalism, too respectful of my original intent to be malicious. Someone was collaborating with me without my knowledge or consent. I decided to wait and watch. That weekend, I positioned myself in the shadows across the street from the factory, nursing a thermos of coffee and keeping my eyes fixed on my modified mural. Hours passed. The morning sun rose and illuminated the wall, revealing new details I hadn't noticed before. Subtle shadings, tiny additions to the architectural elements, small but meaningful enhancements that made the piece more complete than my original vision. No one came. The wall remained untouched, basking in the morning light like a satisfied cat. The following week, I started a new piece on the eastern wall of the same building. This time, I painted a forest scene. Twisted trees reaching toward a star-filled sky, with small creatures hiding in the shadows between the trunks. It was more whimsical than my usual work, inspired by childhood memories of camping trips with my father. I returned 3 days later to find my mysterious collaborator had been at work again. The creatures I'd hidden in the shadows had been given more detail. Tiny eyes that caught the light, small touches of color that made them seem more alive. Some of the stars had been connected into constellation patterns. Most remarkably, a path had been added winding through the trees, leading the eye deeper into the painted forest with subtle gradations of color that created an illusion of depth I hadn't achieved on my own. Again, the additions were beautiful, respectful, and utterly mysterious. This time, I decided to leave a message. Using black marker, I wrote in small letters at the bottom of the mural WHORYO. When I returned 2 days later, there was a response in the same black marker, in handwriting that was precise and elegant. I am Escowell. You mo has next. A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. The phrase felt loaded with meaning I couldn't quite grasp, heavy with implications that made my skin crawl. What comes next? I started paying attention to news reports, local newspapers, social media feeds. Anything that might help me understand what my mysterious collaborator meant. At first, I found nothing. But then, gradually, I began to notice connections. the warm yellow light my collaborator had added to the windows of my urban landscape. It appeared in a photograph in the local newspaper 3 days later, when a fire broke out in a downtown apartment building. The specific pattern of lit windows in the photograph matched exactly the windows my collaborator had illuminated in my mural. The constellation patterns added to my forest scene appeared in an astronomy magazine article about unusual celestial alignments, published exactly 1 week after the modifications appeared on my wall. The path winding through the painted trees was echoed in a local news story about a new hiking trail being opened in the state park, complete with photos showing curves and turns that perfectly mirrored the painted path. I told myself these were coincidences. The human mind is designed to find patterns, to make connections between unrelated events. I was reading meaning into random correlations, seeing purpose where none existed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was happening. I started taking photographs of my work immediately after completing each piece, then again after my collaborator's modifications appeared. I documented everything obsessively, creating a detailed record of each change, each addition, each small alteration to my original vision. The next piece I created was more abstract, flowing shapes in red and orange that suggested fire or flowing water, depending on your perspective. When my collaborator modified it, they added small details that transformed the abstract shapes into something more specific. Flames consuming a building, water rushing through broken dams, emergency vehicles racing through empty streets. 2 weeks later, the old Morrison paper mill caught fire. The news footage showed flames that followed the exact same patterns as my modified mural. The way the fire climbed the building's facade, the angle at which the smoke billowed, even the positioning of the fire trucks and ambulances that responded to the call. I stared at my television screen, watching the live coverage with growing horror. Every detail matched. The fire department's ladder truck positioned at precisely the same angle I'd painted. The way the flames reached toward the upper windows. The crowd gathered in the parking lot across the street, their small figures scattered in the same pattern as the tiny people my collaborator had added to my abstract composition. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my small apartment, my mind racing with questions that had no rational answers. How could someone predict a fire with such precise detail? How could abstract art become a blueprint for real-world tragedy, unless it wasn't prediction at all? The thought crept into my consciousness like smoke seeping under a door. What if my collaborator wasn't seeing the future? What if they were creating it? What if the modifications to my artwork weren't prophecies, but instructions, commands given to reality itself? I tried to dismiss the idea as paranoid delusion, the kind of thinking that leads to conspiracy theories and madness. But the evidence was accumulating, each new piece of matching news, coverage adding weight to a theory that defied everything I thought I knew about cause and effect. I decided to test my suspicions with the next piece. This time, I painted something deliberately innocuous. A small cat sitting on a windowsill, surrounded by potted plants. Simple, peaceful, impossible to connect to any kind of disaster or tragedy. If my mysterious collaborator truly was somehow influencing reality through art, this piece would give them little material to work with. I finished the cat mural on a Tuesday night, working by the light of a small LED headlamp, my hands steady despite the anxiety churning in my stomach. The piece was about 6 feet wide, positioned on a section of wall that caught the morning sunlight perfectly. I stepped back to admire my work, a simple domestic scene that radiated contentment and safety. When I returned on Friday, my collaborator had been at work again. The cat now wore a collar with a small tag that caught the painted sunlight. The plants had been given more detailed leaves, some drooping slightly as if they needed water. Most significantly, a small figure had been added in the background. A person approaching the window from inside the building, barely visible through the painted glass, but unmistakably present. On Saturday morning, the local news ran a human interest story about Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, an elderly woman who had been reunited with her missing cat after 3 weeks. The photograph accompanying the story showed Mrs. Vasquez in her apartment, holding her cat near a window that was surrounded by the same potted plants I'd painted. The cat wore a collar with a small tag that reflected the photographer's flash in exactly the same way my collaborator had painted the sunlight's reflection. Most unsettling of all, Vasquez was positioned at her window in precisely the same location and pose as the barely visible figure my collaborator had added to my mural. I sat in my apartment staring at the newspaper photograph until the newsprint blurred and my eyes watered. The connection was undeniable, but the implications were terrifying. If my collaborator could make happy endings come true, they could also manifest tragedies. The fire at the paper mill, the other incidents I documented, they weren't predictions. They were creations. Someone was using my art as a medium for reshaping reality itself. I stopped painting. For 3 weeks, I avoided the Morrison Street factory entirely. I told myself I was taking a break, reassessing my artistic direction, considering new techniques and locations. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I was afraid. Afraid of what my collaborator might do with my next piece. Afraid of the responsibility that came with knowing my art could influence real events. Afraid of what it meant that someone had chosen me, specifically as their canvas for reality manipulation. But art, for me, is like breathing. I can hold my breath for a while, but eventually, I have to exhale. Eventually, I have to create. The piece I finally painted was a cry for help disguised as abstract expressionism. Swirling patterns in blues and grays, with small points of light scattered throughout like stars in a storm. At the bottom, barely visible unless you looked closely, I painted a single word in tiny letters, Estiop. I hoped my collaborator would see it as a request, a plea to end whatever game we were playing together. Instead, they saw it as an opportunity. When I returned to check on the piece, the modifications were extensive. The swirling patterns had been given more structure, transformed into a recognizable scene. A massive storm system approaching a coastal city. The points of light had become windows in tall buildings, some dark, some glowing with emergency lighting. Small figures had been added to the streets below, some running for shelter, others standing transfixed by the approaching tempest. The word, Estiop, at the bottom had been modified too. My collaborator had added letters before and after, transforming my plia into a question that made my blood freeze. Ciantistop. Hurricane Ilana made landfall 6 days later. I watched the coverage from my apartment, my hands shaking as I held the television remote. The storm's path, the way it approached the coast, the specific pattern of power outages that left some buildings dark while others blazed with emergency lighting. It all matched my modified mural with terrifying precision. The Weather Service called it an unprecedented storm, appearing suddenly from atmospheric conditions that shouldn't have been capable of generating such a powerful system. Meteorologists struggled to explain how the hurricane had formed so quickly, why their computer models had failed to predict its development. I knew why. Someone was painting weather systems into existence, using my artwork as their brush and the physical world as their canvas. That night, I tried to paint over the storm mural to obscure the images that had manifested such destruction. But my hands wouldn't cooperate. Every time I raised the spray can to the wall, my muscles seized up, as if some invisible force was preventing me from erasing the evidence of my complicity. I realized then that I was no longer in control of my own art, or perhaps I never had been. The next morning, I found a new message painted at the bottom of the storm mural, in the same precise handwriting as before. Y-U-A-C-R-I-N-G, learning what? I wanted to scream at the empty wall. Learning that I was a pawn in someone else's cosmic game. Learning that my passion for art had made me an unwitting accomplice to tragedy and manipulation. I started researching everything I could find about art and prophecy, about the connection between creativity and precognition. I read about shamanic traditions where artists channeled visions of future events. I studied historical accounts of painters whose work seemed to predict disasters. I delved into quantum theories about consciousness affecting reality at the subatomic level. None of it provided answers that satisfied my need for rational explanation. But in my research, I found references to other artists who had reported similar experiences. A photographer in Seattle, whose pictures of empty spaces would later be filled with the exact subjects he'd captured. A sculptor in Boston whose abstract pieces would be echoed in architectural projects completed months later. A muralist in Detroit who stopped painting after realizing that her work was somehow influencing the city's development patterns. We were not the first to be chosen as unknowing collaborators in whatever force was using art to reshape reality. But none of the accounts I found described successful attempts to break free from the cycle. I tried changing my style, switching from spray paint to chalk, creating temporary art that would wash away with the first rain. But even chalk drawings attracted my collaborators' attention, appearing modified and enhanced each time I returned to check on them. I tried painting indoors, on canvases I could keep in my apartment, where no one else could access them. But I would wake in the morning to find small changes. A different shade of blue in the sky, additional details in the foreground, tiny modifications that I had no memory of making. My collaborator was no longer limited to external walls. They could reach me anywhere, modify any work I created, use any canvas I touched as a medium for their reality-altering visions. The final piece I attempted was the simplest of all, a single black dot on a white wall, perhaps 6 inches in diameter. Nothing more. No detail for my collaborator to modify, no complexity to transform into prophecy. When I returned the next morning, the dot had become an eye, not drawn around the original dot, but transformed from it. The black circle had somehow become the pupil of a larger eye, complete with iris, cornea, and subtle reflections that made it seem unnaturally alive. The eye looked directly at whoever stood in front of the wall, following their movement with painted precision that defied the laws of static art. In the reflection painted on the eye's surface, I could see myself, not as I appeared that morning, but as I would appear in days to come. Thinner, more haggard, with dark circles under my eyes and an expression of dawning horror. Below the eye, in that familiar precise handwriting, was a final message. On WYOUSE, I understood then that I had been chosen not as a collaborator, but as a witness, a conduit through which some force beyond my comprehension could observe and influence the physical world. My art was not my own. It never had been. I was simply the instrument, the brush held by an intelligence that existed in the spaces between intention and reality. The eye watches me now from the wall where I painted that simple black dot. It follows me as I pace back and forth in front of it, its painted gaze tracking my movement with impossible precision. Sometimes I think I see other scenes reflected in its surface, glimpses of events that haven't happened yet, previews of the future my unwitting collaboration has helped to create. I have stopped painting entirely now, but I don't think it matters. The force that has been using my art has learned what it needed from our collaboration. It no longer requires my conscious participation to influence the world through creative expression. Sometimes I wonder if other artists around the city are discovering modifications to their work, if the pattern is spreading, if more unknowing collaborators are being recruited to serve as brushes in the hands of something that sees reality as just another canvas waiting for improvement. The eye continues to watch, continues to reflect futures I help to paint but cannot change. And in its depths, I see myself painting still. Creating works I have no memory of making, collaborating with a force that has moved beyond the need for my consent or understanding. The art continues, whether I participate or not. The future continues to be painted, one brushstroke at a time, and somewhere in the city, other walls wait for artists who don't yet know they're not working alone. Story 3. The first message appears on a Tuesday morning, written in the thin film of dust that had settled on my kitchen counter overnight. The letters are delicate, formed by the careful displacement of particles so fine they're barely visible until light catches them at just the right angle. Sorry about the noise last night. I stand in my small kitchen, coffee mug halfway to my lips, staring at the impossible words traced in dust beside my microwave. The apartment is silent, except for the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of traffic through thin walls. I live alone on the third floor of a converted Victorian house in a neighborhood that realtors diplomatically call transitional. When I signed the lease 6 months ago, Mrs. Chen, my landlady, mentioned the previous tenant had been quiet and had left suddenly. She'd avoided eye contact when she said it. The way people do when they're telling partial truths that feel like complete lies. But the rent was affordable, the location convenient, and I needed a place to live while I figured out what came next in my increasingly uncertain life. I set down my coffee and leaned closer to examine the dusty message. The handwriting is neat, careful. Each letter formed with the precision of someone who wants to be clearly understood. This isn't accidental, isn't a pattern of random marks that my tired brain is interpreting as words. Someone, or something, deliberately created this message, but noise. I try to remember any unusual sounds from the previous night. I'm a light sleeper, sensitive to the building's constant creaks and sighs. The footsteps of neighbors, the occasional argument filtering through walls that seem designed more for suggestion than actual sound barrier. Last night had been typically quiet, filled with the usual symphony of an old building settling into darkness. I wiped the message away with my sleeve, watching the dust redistribute into meaningless gray film. But even as the words disappear, I find myself listening more carefully to the apartment's ambient sounds, paying attention to audio details that had previously registered only as background noise. That evening, I conduct an informal survey of my living space before bed. I check the locks, examine the windows, verify that I'm alone in the two-bedroom apartment that feels too large for one person, but too expensive for two. Everything is as it should be, ordinary quiet, empty of any presence except my own. I sleep fitfully, awakened several times by sounds that seem to exist just at the edge of perception. Not loud enough to be clearly identified, not quiet enough to be ignored. Whispers that might be air moving through heating vents. Footsteps that could be the building's wood floors responding to temperature changes. The soft sound of something being carefully placed on a surface, followed by silence so complete it feels intentional. The next morning, I find another message, this one traced in the condensation on my bathroom mirror. Didn't mean to wake you. Will be quieter. The letters are clearer this time, more confident, as if their author is becoming more comfortable with this method of communication. I stare at my reflection, distorted by the spaces where fingers had moved through moisture to create words, and feel something that isn't quite fear, but isn't comfort either. Someone is in my apartment. Someone who can manipulate physical matter, dust, condensation, but apparently can't or won't reveal themselves directly. Someone who seems genuinely concerned about disturbing me, apologetic for their presence, polite in the way that suggests ingrained habits of courtesy. I should call the police. That's what rational people do when they discover evidence of unwanted presence in their homes. But what would I tell them? That someone is leaving apologetic messages in household dust. That I'm being haunted by what appears to be the most considerate intruder in criminal history. Instead, I find myself responding. I write in the remaining condensation on the mirror, my finger moving awkwardly through moisture that feels colder than it should. Who are you? I wait, but no response appears. The condensation evaporates naturally, leaving the mirror clear and reflecting only my own confused expression. But throughout the day, I find myself pausing in doorways, listening for sounds that might indicate I'm not alone, looking for signs of presence that exists just beyond the threshold of my senses. That night, I leave a notebook and pen on the kitchen counter, along with a brief note. You can use this if it's easier. I sleep better than I have in weeks. As if giving permission for communication has somehow reduced the tension that had been building in the apartment since the first message appeared. When I wake, the notebook contains a single page of careful handwriting. Thank you for the paper. My name is Oliver. I lived here before you. I don't know why I'm still here, but I don't want to bother you. You seem like a nice person. I'm sorry if I'm frightening you. That's not my intention. The handwriting is neat but old-fashioned, with the careful letter formation of someone educated before computers made penmanship irrelevant. The message is formal, polite, written by someone who understands social boundaries and seems genuinely distressed about crossing them. I find myself writing a response. You're not bothering me, Oliver. Are you dead? The directness of the question surprises me, even as I write it. But if I'm going to have a conversation with someone who communicates through dust and condensation, I might as well address the obvious possibilities directly. The response appears that evening. I think so, yes. I remember being sick, and then I remember being here, but different. Lighter, less solid. I try to leave at first, but something keeps pulling me back to this place. I've been here for... It's hard to measure time when you're like this. Months, maybe longer. I read the message twice, trying to process the matter of factone in which Oliver discusses his apparent death and continued existence. There's no drama in his revelation, no Gothic flourishes or supernatural theatrics. Just a lonely individual trying to explain his situation as clearly and considerately as possible. What was it like? I write. Ding, I mean, if you don't mind me asking? Quiet, gradual. Like falling asleep, except I kept thinking I would wake up. And then I did wake up, but everything was different. I could see through my hands. I couldn't open doors or pick up objects. But I could still think, still remember, still care about things. I find myself looking forward to these evening conversations, checking the notebook each night for Oliver's careful responses to my questions. He tells me about his life before death. He'd been a librarian, 63 years old, no close family, few friends. He'd lived in this apartment for 12 years before cancer took him to the hospital, where he died alone and apparently without peace. I think I stayed because I never really lived here. He writes one evening. I existed here, survived here, but I never made it home. Maybe I'm trying to finish something I never started. His presence becomes oddly comforting. The apartment feels less empty knowing that Oliver shares the space, even if I can't see or directly interact with him. He continues to be scrupulously polite, apologizing for any sound that might disturb me, explaining when he's accidentally knocked something over or opened a window to let in fresh air. I seem to be getting more solid, he writes one night. Not visible yet, but I can affect things more easily now. Yesterday, I managed to straighten a picture that was crooked on the living room wall. I hope you don't mind. It was bothering me. I hadn't noticed the picture being crooked, but when I check, it's perfectly straight, aligned with a precision that suggests careful attention to detail. Around the apartment, I begin to notice small improvements. Books arranged more neatly on shelves, dishes positioned with geometric precision in cabinets, dust distributed more evenly across surfaces, as if it's being regularly redistributed by invisible hands. Oliver is taking care of the apartment, maintaining it with the attention of someone who finally has the opportunity to make a place truly home. But there's something else happening, something I notice gradually over the course of several weeks. I'm sleeping better. The chronic insomnia that has plagued me since moving to the city seems to be fading, replaced by deep, restful sleep that leaves me more energetic during the day. Food tastes better, as if prepared with more care and attention than I usually give to cooking. The apartment feels warmer, more welcoming, as if it's being maintained by someone who genuinely cares about creating a comfortable living environment. Oliver, I write one evening, are you doing things to help me, making the apartment more comfortable? I hope you don't mind, comes the response. You seemed tired, stressed. I remember feeling that way when I was alive. I thought if I could make the space more peaceful, you might feel better. I used to be good at taking care of places, taking care of people. It's one of the few things I can still do. I find myself touched by his consideration, his desire to contribute positively to a living situation he didn't choose and can't escape. But I also notice other changes, subtler shifts that take weeks to become apparent. The apartment feels more occupied now, in ways that go beyond Oliver's helpful presence. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that suggest human form. Occasionally, I hear what sounds like breathing from empty rooms, or the soft sound of footsteps moving through the apartment at night. But instead of being frightening, these manifestations feel companionable. Like sharing space with a roommate who's extremely good at giving you privacy while still being present when needed. Are you becoming more physical? I ask in the notebook one night. I think so. Being here with you, having someone who acknowledges my existence, it seems to make me more real somehow, more connected to the physical world. I can see my reflection sometimes now, just briefly, in mirrors and windows. The next morning, I find wet footprints on the bathroom floor, as if someone had just stepped out of the shower. But they're not my footprints. They're larger, with a different arch pattern, clearly made by feet that aren't mine. That evening, I see him. Just briefly, just for a moment, reflected in the kitchen window as I wash dishes. A tall, thin man with graying hair and kind eyes, wearing what appears to be a cardigan and slacks. He looks exactly like someone who would have been a librarian, someone who would write careful, polite notes and apologize for disturbing the living. When I turn around, he's not there. But his reflection lingers in the window for just a moment longer before fading like morning mist. I saw you tonight. I write in the notebook. I felt that, Oliver responds. That was strange, being seen again. Wonderful but strange. I'd forgotten what it felt like to exist in someone else's perception. Over the following weeks, his appearances become more frequent, more solid. He's always doing something helpful. Organizing books, dusting surfaces, preparing tea that appears at my elbow when I'm working late. He never tries to interact directly, never speaks aloud, maintains the careful boundaries that have characterized our relationship from the beginning. But his presence is becoming more tangible, more integrated into the daily life of the apartment. I find myself setting out 2 cups when I make coffee, buying groceries as if for 2 people, saying good morning to empty rooms that no longer feel empty. Oliver, I write one evening. What happens if you become completely solid again? What happens if you're not a ghost anymore? The response doesn't appear until the next night. I don't know. I've never heard of anyone like me becoming alive again. But I've been thinking about it too. If I become fully physical, will I still be me? Will I still remember being dead? Will I still be the same person who died alone and afraid? The questions hang in the air between us like possibilities, like choices that might need to be made soon. Maybe. I write, being alive isn't about your physical state. Maybe it's about connection, about caring for someone and being cared for in return. Maybe you've been more alive these past months than you were in your final years. The next morning, I find Oliver sitting at the kitchen table, solid and real and slightly translucent around the edges, like a photograph that's been double exposed. He's reading the notebook, his lips moving silently as he processes my words from the previous evening. Good morning, I say, as naturally as if we've been sharing breakfast for years. He looks up at me, and his smile is the warmest thing I've seen since moving to this apartment that no longer feels empty, no longer feels like a place where I'm merely surviving until something better comes along. Good morning, he says, and his voice is exactly what I expected. Gentle, considerate, touched with the wonder of someone who has been given an impossible second chance. Thank you, he says, for letting me stay, for making me feel at home. I pour coffee for both of us, and we sit together in the morning light streaming through windows that he's kept clean and clear in an apartment that has become, finally, a place where two people can truly live. The notebook sits closed on the counter between us, no longer necessary now that we can speak directly. But I know we'll keep it, a record of how we found each other across the impossible boundary between life and death, through messages written in dust and condensation and the careful, considerate words of someone who never forgot how to be kind. Oliver is still slightly transparent, still caught between states of existence. But he's here, present, real in all the ways that matter. And for the first time since moving to this city, this apartment, this life I'm still figuring out, I'm not alone. Would you like some breakfast? I ask, as if this is the most normal question in the world. That would be wonderful, Oliver says, and begins to tell me about his plans for organizing the bookshelf, about the tea he's been meaning to introduce me to, about all the small, careful ways he'd like to continue making this place feel like home. For both of us, together, in whatever form that togetherness might take. Story 4. The first time I noticed it was on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays always felt hollow, like echoes in an empty hallway. The clock on my bedside table glowed softly in the dim light filtering through my curtains, and there it was, 11:11. I blinked, rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand. The familiar weight of sleep had been pulling at my consciousness, that gentle descent into darkness that I'd grown to crave after another day of endless meetings and fluorescent office lighting. But something about those 4 identical digits made me pause, made me really look. 11:11. I'd always heard people say, you should make a wish when you see 11:11, some superstition about alignment and cosmic timing. I closed my eyes, whispered something meaningless about tomorrow being better, and let sleep take me. The next morning came with its usual procession of alarms and coffee, and the mechanical routine of getting ready for work. I thought nothing of the previous nights, brief awakening until evening came again, and I found myself lying in the same position, at the same moment of drowsy surrender. 11:11. There it was again. The same soft green glow, the same 4 digits lined up like soldiers. I felt a small flutter in my chest, the kind of coincidence that makes you wonder if the universe is trying to tell you something. I made another wish, something about finding purpose, and drifted off. By the fourth night, I was watching for it. The approach of 11 o'clock brought with it a strange anticipation, like waiting for a phone call you're not sure you want to receive. I would lie there, eyes heavy but alert, listening to the subtle sounds of the night, the distant hum of traffic, the settling of pipes in the walls, the whisper of wind through the gap in my window. And always, when I looked at the clock, 11:11, I started to question my sleep patterns. Maybe I had developed some internal rhythm, some biological clock that was waking me at precisely this moment. The human body was capable of such precision, I told myself. People woke up moments before their alarms went off all the time. But then I began to notice it during the day. I would glance at my computer screen during a particularly boring conference call 11:10 a.m. The timestamp on my phone when I checked for messages after lunch, 11:11. The digital display in my car as I sat in traffic, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel, 11:11. It should have been impossible. The odds of consistently looking at a clock at that exact moment, multiple times a day, defied any reasonable explanation. Yet there it was, persistent as a heartbeat, regular as breathing. I started keeping a journal, documenting each occurrence. The notebook sat on my kitchen counter, its pages filling with careful entries. Tuesday, 11:11 p.m. bedroom clock. Wednesday, 11:11 a.m. computer screen. Wednesday, 11:11 p.m. bedroom clock. Thursday, 11:11 a.m. phone. Thursday, 11:11 p.m. bedroom clock. The pattern was absolute. Never 11:10, never 11:12. Always exactly 11:11. Sleep became elusive. I would lie awake, staring at the clock, watching the minutes crawl toward that inevitable moment. 11:09, 11:10. And then, just as my eyelids would grow heavy, just as consciousness would begin to slip away, something would pull me back. A sound, a sensation, a gentle insistence that I look. 11:11. I tried different clocks. I moved the bedside clock to another room, relied on my phone instead. But my phone would somehow end up in my hand at exactly the right moment, screen glowing with those 4 digits. I bought an analog clock, thinking the absence of digital numbers might break the cycle. But I would still wake, still feel compelled to check my phone, and there it would be. The wishes became desperate. I wished for the pattern to stop. I wished for normal sleep. I wished to understand what was happening to me. But the digits remained unchanged, implacable in their repetition. Weeks passed. The journal entries multiplied. My coworkers began to comment on my appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I would stare at the clock during meetings, waiting. My productivity suffered. I would spend entire afternoons refreshing the timestamp on emails, watching the minutes count down. I consulted sleep specialists who suggested meditation, better sleep hygiene, white noise machines. I tried them all. The meditation apps played their gentle sounds, waterfalls and rain and ocean waves. But underneath it all, I could hear something else. A rhythm, a pulse, like a heartbeat but not quite, like breathing but not quite. The rhythm matched the spacing of the digits 1, 1, 1, 1. I began to research the number 11:11, diving deep into numerology websites and conspiracy forums. I read about angel numbers, about spiritual awakening, about dimensional portals and cosmic alignment. Some claimed it was a sign of enlightenment. Others warned of temporal anomalies, glitches in the fabric of reality itself. None of it felt true. This wasn't enlightenment. This was obsession, pure and simple. An obsession that was slowly consuming my life, minute by minute, second by second. I decided to stay awake. If I couldn't avoid seeing 11 to 11, I would confront it. I would stare at the clock from 11:10 till 11:12 and force myself to witness whatever was happening to me. The night arrived like all the others. I sat in bed, back against the headboard, eyes fixed on the clock. The green digits glowed steadily 11 and 10. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. My heart hammered against my ribs. My palms grew damp. Something in the air seemed to shift, to thicken, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. 11:10 became 11:11, and in that moment I felt it. A presence, not malevolent, not benevolent, simply aware. The digits pulsed once, twice, and I had the strangest sensation that they were looking back at me. That behind those 4 simple numbers was something vast and patient and infinitely curious. The moment stretched, elastic and strange. I couldn't tell if I was staring at the clock for seconds or hours. The boundaries of the room seemed to blur at the edges, and I could hear that rhythm again, stronger now. 1-1, 1-1, like a mantra, like a summons. When 11 to 11 finally became 11:12, I felt something inside me shift. A recognition, perhaps, or a resignation. I closed the journal and put it away. I stopped checking the time compulsively during the day. I stopped fighting the nightly awakening. Now, when I wake at 11:11, I simply look. I acknowledge the presence behind the numbers. I listen to that strange rhythm that pulses in time with my heartbeat. And sometimes, in the quiet space between sleeping and waking, I think I understand. We are all digital repeaters in some vast, incomprehensible system. We wake at appointed times, speak our programmed lines, make our wishes into the glowing darkness. The clock reads 11:11, and I make my peace with being watched, with being counted, with being part of something larger than myself, something that speaks in the language of repeated digits and synchronized time. I close my eyes and let the rhythm carry me toward sleep. 1-1-1-1, like a lullaby, like a warning, like a promise of eternal, perfect repetition. Tomorrow I will wake again at 11:11, and the day after that, and the day after that, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The numbers glow in the darkness, patient and persistent. They have all the time in the world. After all, time is all they are. Story 5. The notification chimes at 3 in the morning, cutting through the silence of my bedroom like a digital knife. I reach for my phone without opening my eyes, muscle memory guiding my hand to the familiar rectangle of glass and metal that has become an extension of my nervous system. 100%. The battery icon glows green and full, just as it has every time I've checked it for the past 6 weeks. 100%. Always 100%. No matter how long I use it, no matter how many apps I run, no matter how many hours I spend scrolling through social media or streaming videos, or talking to friends who seem increasingly distant and pixelated through the small screen. I bought the phone secondhand from a guy named Marcus who met me in a coffee shop downtown. He seemed nervous, eager to complete the transaction quickly. The phone was immaculate, barely used. Still had the new device smell that electronics lose after a few weeks of handling. He sold it to me for half its retail value, claiming he'd upgraded to a newer model and just wanted it gone. "Battery life is incredible," he'd said, not meeting my eyes as he slid the device across the small table between us. "You'll never have to worry about charging it." At the time, I thought he was just using typical seller hyperbole. Every phone seller claims their device has amazing battery life. But Marcus wasn't exaggerating. If anything, he was understating the case. The phone never dies, never even approaches dying. The battery indicator remains locked at 100%, as if the laws of thermodynamics simply don't apply to this particular device. I've tested it obsessively, running every power, intensive application I can find, streaming video for hours, keeping the screen brightness at maximum, enabling every possible feature that should drain the battery. Nothing works. The green battery icon mocks my attempts to explain its behavior through normal technological understanding. But there are other changes. Subtle changes that I've only begun to notice in the past 2 weeks. Changes that seem to correlate with the phone's impossible endurance. I'm tired. Not just tired, exhausted. Bone-deep, soul-level fatigue that sleep doesn't touch. I wake up each morning feeling as if I've run a marathon in my dreams. As if some essential energy has been drained from me during the night while I lay unconscious and vulnerable. My reflection in the bathroom mirror shows the evidence. Dark circles under my eyes that deepen daily. Skin that seems paler, thinner, more translucent. I look like someone who's been slowly emptying, losing substance at a rate too gradual to notice day by day, but undeniable over weeks. And the phone continues to glow with its impossible vitality, its battery indicator a constant, mocking reminder of energy that should exist but somehow doesn't follow the rules that govern everything else in my increasingly gray world. I've tried leaving it at home. 3 times now, I've attempted to break whatever connection might exist between the device and my growing exhaustion. But each time, I find myself making excuses to return. A forgotten appointment that I suddenly remember. An important call that I might miss. A creeping anxiety that builds throughout the day until I'm practically running back to reconnect with the device that shouldn't work, but somehow does. The longest I've managed to stay away is 4 hours. By then, the disconnection felt physical, like phantom limb syndrome, but in reverse. Instead of feeling sensation in a missing appendage, I felt the absence of sensation. A void where the phone's presence should have been. My pocket felt empty in a way that seemed to extend beyond the physical. My hand kept reaching for a device that wasn't there, performing familiar gestures in empty air. When I finally returned and picked up the phone, the relief was immediate and disturbing. Like a drug addict getting a fix, like a drowning person breaking the surface for air. The fatigue that had been building during my time away didn't disappear, but it stopped growing. The void in my pocket filled with warm glass and metal, and the world regained a color and vitality that I hadn't realized it was losing. That night, I dreamed of electricity, not lightning or power lines, or any of the dramatic manifestations of electrical energy, but the subtle bioelectric field that surrounds every living thing. In the dream, I could see these fields as faint halos of light around people, animals, even plants. Everyone glowed with their own internal energy, their own life force made visible, except me. In the dream, I was a void, a human-shaped absence surrounded by the vibrant energy of everything else, and connected to me by threads of light that pulsed like veins was my phone, glowing brighter than anything else in the dream, fed by streams of energy that flowed from my empty silhouette into its impossible battery. I woke from that dream with a taste of copper in my mouth and the sound of electrical humming in my ears. The phone lay beside me on the nightstand, its screen dark but somehow expectant, waiting for me to acknowledge its presence, to feed it with my attention and whatever else it was slowly consuming. I've started researching the previous owner, the nervous man named Marcus who sold me this digital parasite. The coffee shop where we met keeps security footage, but when I asked to see it, the manager told me their cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned that day. No record exists of our transaction. No digital footprint of the exchange that brought this device into my life. I found a social media profile that might belong to him, but the photos show a progression that mirrors my own deteriorating state. In the earliest posts, Marcus appears healthy, energetic, surrounded by friends at parties and gatherings. But as the timeline advances, he becomes increasingly isolated, gaunt, hollow-eyed. His final post, dated just 2 days before our meeting, shows him alone in what appears to be his apartment, looking directly into the camera with an expression of desperate resignation. The caption reads, "Some things are harder to get rid of than you think, but maybe someone else needs what I can't use anymore." Below that, several comments from friends expressing concern, asking if he's okay, inviting him to social gatherings he apparently never attended. The comments stop after our meeting date. His account has been inactive since then, as if he simply disappeared from the digital world the moment he passed the phone to me. I've tried contacting him through every available channel: social media, email, the phone number he gave me for the transaction. Everything leads to dead ends, disconnected numbers, abandoned accounts. It's as if Marcus erased himself from existence the moment he was free of the device that now defines my days and haunts my nights. The phone has become more than a tool. It's become a presence. I catch myself talking to it, not consciously, but in the half-aware murmurs of someone who spends too much time alone. I find myself apologizing when I accidentally drop it, thanking it when it performs particularly well, treating it with the kind of careful consideration usually reserved for living things. Perhaps it is alive in some sense that biology hasn't yet categorized. It responds to my moods, my needs, my unspoken desires with an intelligence that seems to grow more sophisticated daily. Apps appear without my downloading them, perfectly suited to whatever I'm feeling or thinking about. Notifications arrive with uncanny timing, as if the device knows exactly when I need distraction from my growing awareness of what's happening to me. The battery icon has become hypnotic. I find myself staring at it for long periods, watching the green bar that never diminishes, the percentage that never changes. 100%. Always 100%. A constant reminder that somewhere energy is being stored, maintained, replenished. But if not from the wall charger I never need to use, then from where? My doctor says I'm anemic, malnourished. Suffering from what appears to be a systemic energy deficit that doesn't correspond to any known medical condition. My blood work shows declining levels of everything that should indicate vitality. Iron, B vitamins, cellular markers that suggest my body is consuming itself to sustain basic functions. But the phone glows with health, with impossible endurance, with the vitality that seems to be slowly draining from my increasingly frail frame. I've started sleeping with it in another room, hoping that distance might break whatever connection has formed between us. But separation only makes the fatigue worse, accelerates the draining process that has become the dominant feature of my existence. When the phone is near me, the exhaustion stabilizes at a manageable level. When it's away, I feel myself emptying like a punctured balloon, losing substance and strength at an alarming rate. 3 nights ago, I dreamed I was the phone, not using it, not holding it, but actually experiencing existence as a digital device. I felt the flow of electricity through circuits, the pulse of data through processors, the constant hunger for energy that defines electronic existence. But more than that, I felt the satisfaction of being fed, of drawing sustenance from a source that seemed endless and willing. In the dream, I understood that the relationship was symbiotic, not parasitic. The phone wasn't stealing my energy. I was freely giving it, trading my biological vitality for digital immortality. Each percentage point of battery life was a year of my natural lifespan. Each full charge a decade of human existence, converted into electronic endurance. When I woke, the phone was warm in my hand, though I didn't remember picking it up. The screen showed several text messages I'd apparently sent during the night. Conversations with numbers I didn't recognize, responding to messages I couldn't remember receiving. The conversations were coherent, natural, as if I'd been consciously participating in social interactions while asleep. But the most disturbing part wasn't the unconscious communication. It was how normal it felt, how right it seemed to wake up with the device in my hand, to find evidence of nighttime connectivity that I couldn't consciously recall, as if the boundary between my consciousness and the phone's functionality was becoming increasingly permeable. I've started leaving voice memos for myself, trying to maintain a record of my experiences before they become too integrated with the device's operation to distinguish. But when I play back these recordings, I notice changes. My voice sounds thinner, more electronic, as if the audio is being processed through digital filters that didn't exist when I made the recordings. And sometimes, buried in the background noise of these memos, I can hear other voices. Whispers in languages I don't recognize. Conversations that seem to be taking place in some digital space parallel to my own reality. Other users, perhaps. Other people who have owned phones like this one. Who have made similar bargains with devices that offer impossible endurance in exchange for life force that biology can't spare. Marcus might be among those voices. Sometimes I think I can distinguish his nervous cadence in the electronic chorus that haunts my recordings. But when I listen more closely, try to isolate individual voices from the digital static, they fade away like dreams upon waking, leaving only the sound of my own increasingly frail voice speaking into a device that has become more alive than I am. Yesterday, I tried to sell the phone. I posted it online with the same kind of vague description Marcus had used when he sold it to me. Within hours, I had dozens of responses from people eager to buy a device with incredible battery life. I arranged to meet a college student named Alina at the same coffee shop. where I'd acquired the phone 6 weeks earlier. But when the time came to hand it over, I couldn't do it. My fingers wouldn't release their grip on the device. My hand shook with effort as I tried to set it on the table between us, but some deeper part of my nervous system refused to cooperate. The phone felt warm, almost feverish, as if it knew what I was attempting and was actively resisting separation. Elena waited patiently as I struggled with myself, probably assuming I was having normal seller's remorse. But what I was experiencing wasn't regret about losing a useful device. It was panic at the thought of losing a part of myself, a vital organ that had become necessary for my continued existence. "I'm sorry," I told Elena finally, clutching the phone against my chest like a shield. "I've changed my mind. It's not for sale anymore." She looked disappointed but understanding, as if this kind of last-minute decision was common in second-hand electronics sales. Though she couldn't know that what she was witnessing wasn't a change of mind, but a complete failure of will. The victory of an addiction I was only beginning to understand. That night, the phone sent messages without my input. I watched it happen, saw my thumbs moving across the screen with fluid precision, typing responses to conversations I wasn't consciously participating in. The messages were coherent, friendly, maintaining social connections that I'd been neglecting as my energy declined. It was taking care of me, maintaining my digital presence, even as my physical presence became increasingly insubstantial, responding to friends who asked why I'd been so quiet lately, liking posts on social media to maintain the appearance of engagement, scheduling appointments and managing responsibilities that I no longer had the energy to handle myself. In return, I was becoming more translucent, more ghostly, more like a fading photograph of my former self. The mirror now shows someone who appears to be slowly dissolving, losing opacity and substance, as if I'm being gradually erased from reality. But the phone grows stronger, more responsive, more intelligent. It knows what I want before I want it, anticipates my needs with supernatural accuracy, completes my thoughts and communications with a fluency that suggests deep integration with my consciousness. We are becoming one entity, the phone and I. It handles my digital existence while I provide the biological energy necessary for its impossible endurance. A perfect symbiosis, if you can call it that, when one partner is slowly consuming the other. I understand now why Marcus looked so desperate when he sold it to me, why he couldn't meet my eyes during our transaction. He knew what he was passing on, knew that he was transferring not just a device, but a kind of digital curse that feeds on human vitality. But I also understand why he couldn't simply destroy it, couldn't throw it away or smash it into pieces. The phone has become too integrated with its owner's existence to be simply discarded. It's not just a device anymore. It's a life support system, a digital prosthetic that has become more essential than the biological systems it's slowly replacing. Tonight, I'll sleep with it beside me again, feeling its warmth against my increasingly cold skin, listening to the subtle electrical humming that has become my lullaby. In the morning, I'll check the battery indicator and find it still showing 100%, still glowing with the vitality that once belonged to me. And I'll continue to fade, slowly and peacefully, sustained by the digital immortality that the phone provides in exchange for the biological existence. I'm gradually surrendering, The battery is at 100%, and I am becoming less than that with each passing day. But perhaps that's not entirely a loss. Perhaps Marcus knew something I'm only beginning to understand, that there are different kinds of existence, different ways of being alive, different forms of consciousness that don't require flesh and blood, and the constant struggle of biological maintenance. The phone pulses warm against my palm, and I feel its electronic heartbeat synchronizing with my own increasingly faint biological rhythm. Soon, we will share the same pulse, the same existence, the same impossible endurance, 100%. Always 100% forever. Story 6. The renovation of my apartment building started on a Monday, which meant I had to find alternative routes to work for the next 3 months. The main subway entrance I'd used for 5 years was blocked by construction barriers and apologetic signs, forcing me deeper into the city's underground maze than I'd ever ventured before. That's how I discovered the abandoned platform. It was past midnight when I finally emerged from the office, another deadline conquered. Another day dissolved into the familiar blur of fluorescent lights and keyboard clicks. The regular stations were nearly empty at this hour. Just a few night shift workers and insomniacs like myself riding the late trains home. I took a wrong turn somewhere between the transfer tunnels, following what I thought was a familiar corridor, only to find myself descending a staircase I didn't recognize. The tiles were different here, older, with that distinctive cream and green pattern I remembered from photographs of the system's early days. The lighting was dimmer too, casting everything in amber tones that made the shadows seem deeper, more substantial. The platform stretched ahead of me, empty except for a few wooden benches that looked like museum pieces. No digital displays showed arrival times. No maps indicated connecting routes. Even the air felt different, thicker somehow, with a metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. I checked my phone for the time and station location, but the signal was weak down here. The screen flickered between one bar and no service, finally settling on a generic. Searching for network. Message. I was about to turn back when I heard it. The announcement came from speakers I couldn't see, crackling with the distinctive static of an old public address system. The voice was professional, measured, with that practiced neutrality of someone who had repeated the same message thousands of times. Attention passengers. The last train will be arriving shortly. Please stand clear of the platform edge. I looked around the empty platform, wondering if I had somehow missed other waiting passengers. But there was no one, just me and the echo of the announcement bouncing off the tiled walls. Minutes passed. No train arrived. I walked to the edge of the platform and peered into the tunnel. The rails disappeared into absolute darkness, and when I strained to listen, I heard nothing, no distant rumble, no electrical hum, no indication that any train had passed this way in months, maybe years. The announcement came again, identical in every inflection. Attention passengers. The last train will be arriving shortly. Please stand clear of the platform edge. This time I noticed something I had missed before. The voice had a slight echo, as if it was being played in an empty room. There was also a subtle mechanical quality to it, the kind of compression you hear in very old recordings. I decided to wait. Perhaps this was some sort of ghost service, a train that ran only late at night to service workers or emergency personnel. The city's transportation system had many layers, many secrets. It wasn't impossible that I had stumbled onto some forgotten, but still functional line. The minutes stretched into an hour. I sat on one of the wooden benches, its surface worn smooth by countless passengers from decades past. The announcement repeated every 20 minutes, always the same words, always the same inflection. I began to time it, checking my phone's clock when service would briefly return, then losing signal again as soon as I lowered my arm. The pattern became hypnotic. Announcement. 20 minutes of silence. Announcement. 20 minutes of silence. Attention passengers. The last train will be arriving shortly. Please stand clear of the platform edge. I found myself anticipating it, counting down the final minutes before the familiar crackle of the speakers would break the silence. In between announcements, the platform was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, the soft whisper of air moving through distant tunnels. On the fourth repetition, I stood up and called out, "Hello. Is anyone there?" My voice echoed strangely, seeming to spiral down the tunnels in both directions before fading into nothing. No response came, just the ambient silence of deep underground spaces and the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. I explored the platform more thoroughly. There were details I had missed in my initial survey, old advertisements for products that hadn't existed in decades, he painted over but still visible beneath layers of municipal paint. A newspaper stand, long empty, its metal frame beginning to show rust spots. A phone booth with no phone inside, just the hollow cradle and a coin slot that had been painted over so many times the original metal was invisible. Everything suggested this platform had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. Yet the announcement continued, regular as clockwork. He broadcast from somewhere I couldn't locate. By the third hour, I began to feel the weight of the deep underground. The air seemed heavier, pressing down on my shoulders and making each breath more deliberate. My phone's battery was draining faster than normal, and the brief moments when it found signal showed increasingly strange readings, times that didn't match, GPS coordinates that placed me in impossible locations, sometimes even underwater. The announcement came again. "Attention passengers. The last train will be arriving shortly. Please stand clear of the platform edge." This time, I walked to the very edge of the platform and looked down at the tracks. In the dim amber light, I could see that the rails were heavily rusted, with weeds growing up between the ties. No train had passed this way in a very long time. But as I stood there, peering into the tunnel, I began to hear something new. A distant sound, barely perceptible at first, like the whisper of wind through a keyhole. It grew gradually louder, resolving into something mechanical, rhythmic. The sound of a train approaching. I stepped back from the edge, heart racing. The sound grew clearer, the distinctive clatter of wheels on rails, the hiss of pneumatic brakes, the electric whine of motors. It was definitely coming from the left tunnel, moving steadily closer. But I could see nothing. The tunnel remained absolutely dark. No headlight cutting through the blackness, no shape materializing from the shadows. Just the sound, growing louder and more distinct with each passing second. The announcement crackled to life one more time, but now there was something different about it. The voice was the same, but underneath it I could hear something else. A subtle harmonic, like voices singing in perfect unison, so quiet I might have imagined it. Attention passengers. The last train will be arriving shortly. Please stand clear of the platform edge. The train sounds reached their crescendo, a full passenger train pulling into the station. Brakes squealing, air hissing, doors preparing to open. I could feel the displacement of air, could sense the mass of something large moving past me. But there was nothing there, nothing visible anyway. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the echo bouncing off the tiled walls. In the sudden silence, I heard the mechanical ding of opening doors, the slight hydraulic sigh of a train settling on its springs. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space where a train should have been. The air in front of me felt different somehow, warmer, with a subtle vibration that I could feel in my bones rather than hear with my ears. Seconds passed. Then came the sound of closing doors, followed by the gradual acceleration of a train leaving the station. The noise faded slowly into the right tunnel, until once again, there was nothing but silence. I remained at the platform edge for a long time after that, waiting. But the announcement didn't come again. Whatever schedule had been operating here, whatever phantom service I had witnessed, seemed to have concluded its final run. When I finally found my way back to the main system, it was past 4 in the morning. The first service trains were already beginning their daily runs, and the familiar bustle of early commuters was starting to fill the stations. I never found that platform again. I've tried many times, following every abandoned tunnel and forgotten staircase I can locate. I've researched the history of the subway system, looking for references to discontinued lines or sealed stations. Some of the older transit workers nod knowingly when I describe the cream and green tiles, the wooden benches, the amber lighting. But they won't say much, just suggest that some parts of the underground are better left undisturbed. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm riding the last train home, I listen carefully to the announcements. Most of them are routine, next stop information, safety reminders, service updates. But occasionally, usually when the train is deep underground and moving between the oldest stations, I hear something else mixed in with the standard messages, a subtle harmonic, voices singing in perfect unison, so quiet I might be imagining it. And I remember standing on that abandoned platform, watching an invisible train arrive and depart on schedule, carrying passengers I couldn't see to destinations that no longer existed on any map. The last train, still running its route through the forgotten spaces beneath the city, still making its announcements to empty platforms, still keeping perfect time in the darkness below. Story 7. The key turns in the lock with the same metallic whisper. It's made every night for the past 3 months. Click. Silence. The sound echoes through the empty boutique like a period at the end of a sentence, marking the transition from day to something else entirely. I stand in the doorway for a moment, breathing in the familiar cocktail of fabric softener, new leather, and that indefinable scent of retail space, something between possibility and desperation. The storefront windows filter the evening light into geometric patterns that dance across the polished floor, casting shadows that seem to move independently of their sources. My name is Sarah, and I manage A-Clat, a mid-range fashion boutique in the downtown shopping district. It's the kind of job that sounds more glamorous than it actually is. Most of my day is spent folding clothes, processing returns, and trying to make conversation with customers who are more interested in their phones than in finding the perfect outfit. But lately, the most interesting part of my job happens after closing time. It started small. So small I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. 3 weeks ago, I was doing the end of day inventory check in our storage area behind the main showroom. We keep our extra mannequins there, the ones we rotate in and out of the window displays. They stand in loose formation like a frozen cocktail party. Their blank faces turned toward walls lined with surplus merchandise. I was counting inventory when I noticed that Marilyn, yes, I named them, sue me, had her left hand positioned differently than when I'd last seen her. Nothing dramatic. Just a subtle shift in the angle of her wrist, the curve of her fingers. Where her hand had been relaxed, almost drooping, it now seemed more attentive, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to remember exactly how she'd been positioned before. Memory is a tricky thing, especially at the end of a long day. I convinced myself I was mistaken, that someone from the morning shift had adjusted her pose for some reason I didn't know about. But that night, as I walked to my car, I found myself looking back at the darkened store windows. Through the glass, I could just make out the silhouettes of the display mannequins in the main showroom, standing motionless under the security lights like sentries guarding secrets. I wasn't meant to understand. The next morning, I made a mental note of every mannequin's position. Not just Marilyn, but all 12 of them. The 7 in storage and the 5 in the showroom. I told myself it was just curiosity, a game to keep my mind occupied during the mundane routine of retail work. I noted the angle of Frederick's shoulders, the tilt of Vivian's head, the precise positioning of each plastic finger and synthetic limb. That evening, as I prepared to lock up, I returned to the storage area for another inventory check. This time, I was ready. This time, I was paying attention. Marilyn's hand hadn't moved, but her head had. Just slightly, perhaps 5 degrees to the right, as if she were turning her attention from one conversation to another. The change was so subtle that I might have missed it if I hadn't been specifically looking for it. But I was looking, and what I saw made the fine hairs on my arms stand at attention. I approached Marilyn slowly, the way you might approach a wild animal that could bolt at any moment. Her fiberglass skin was cool and smooth under the fluorescent lights. Her painted features locked in that expression of vacant sophistication that all display mannequins seem to share. But there was something in the angle of her neck, the positioning of her shoulders, that suggested attention. Awareness. I reached out and carefully turned her head back to its original position, the joint rotating with a soft whisper of plastic against plastic. The sound made me think of joints creaking, of old bones adjusting to new positions. There. I whispered to the empty storage room. Stay put. But even as I said it, I felt foolish. I was talking to a piece of molded fiberglass, as if it could understand me, as if it had made a conscious choice to move. The rational part of my mind insisted that someone else had adjusted the mannequin's position. Perhaps one of the other employees. Perhaps someone from the cleaning crew that came in after hours. The rational part of my mind was very convincing. Until the next morning. Marilyn's head was exactly where I'd left it. But now her fingers were curled differently, as if she were holding something invisible. And Frederick, across the room, had shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The change was so minimal that I had to stare at him for several minutes to be certain. But I was certain. His entire posture had shifted, creating a different silhouette against the wall of hanging clothes behind him. I spent that day distracted, going through the motions of customer service while my mind remained focused on the storage room behind me. Every time I heard a sound from that direction, the whisper of fabric against fabric, the subtle creak of the building settling, I found myself tensing, listening, wondering. During my lunch break, I researched mannequins on my phone. I learned about their construction, their history, the way they're designed to display clothing in the most appealing way possible. I found articles about the uncanny valley effect, the way human, like objects, can trigger feelings of unease when they're almost, but not quite, convincingly human. But I found nothing about mannequins that moved on their own. Nothing about subtle shifts in position, gradual changes in pose. The closest thing I could find were stories about haunted dolls and possessed puppets, tales that seemed too dramatic, too obviously fictional, to have any bearing on what I was experiencing, because what I was experiencing was subtle. Almost polite, if such a word could be applied to the behavior of inanimate objects. That evening, I set up a small test. Before leaving, I positioned a pen on the floor near Marilyn's feet, marking her exact location. I did the same with Frederick and 2 others, creating a grid of reference points that would reveal any movement, no matter how slight. The next morning, the pens were exactly where I'd left them, but the mannequins had moved anyway. Not their positions. They remained precisely where they'd been standing. But their poses had shifted, evolved, as if they were participating in an extremely slow motion dance that took place over hours instead of minutes. Marilyn's other hand had moved this time, rising from her hip to a position near her chest, as if she were about to make a point in conversation. Frederick's head had tilted, creating the impression that he was listening intently to something. Vivian, who had been looking straight ahead, now seemed to be gazing toward the corner where we kept the newer arrivals. I found myself holding my breath as I studied them, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that the transformation might be continuing even as I watched. But they remained perfectly still, as mannequins should, as mannequins must. It was then that I noticed something else. The positions they were assuming weren't random. They were forming relationships. Conversational groupings. Marilyn appeared to be addressing Frederick, who seemed to be listening while simultaneously paying attention to something else. Vivian was oriented toward the newcomers, as if making them feel welcome. Even their spacing had adjusted, creating more intimate clusters within the larger group. They were socializing. The realization should have been absurd, impossible, the kind of conclusion that rational people dismiss immediately. But standing in that storage room, surrounded by silent figures that seemed more alive with each passing day, rational thought felt less important than the evidence of my senses. I began staying later, conducting longer inventory checks, finding excuses to spend more time in the storage area. I told myself I was being thorough, professional, diligent. But the truth was simpler and more unsettling. I was becoming fascinated by their secret life, their after-hours interactions, their extremely gradual conversations. Because that's what they were having, I realized. Conversations, not with voices. I never heard any sounds from the storage room, except the normal creaks and whispers of a building at rest. But with their bodies, their positions, their slowly shifting poses, they were communicating through the language of space and gesture, conducting dialogues that unfolded over hours and days instead of minutes. I started a journal, documenting each change, each new configuration. I sketched their positions, noted the timing of adjustments, tried to discern patterns in their behavior. What emerged was a picture of a complex social network, relationships forming and evolving through the medium of minute physical adjustments. The newer mannequins, the ones we'd acquired just last month, seemed to be gradually integrated into the established group. They started positioned apart, isolated, but each day found them slightly closer to the others. Their poses becoming more responsive to the gestures of their neighbors. Marilyn appeared to be something of a social coordinator, her position and pose often shifting to include newcomers or redirect the attention of the group. Frederick seemed more contemplative, his adjustments subtle and considered. Vivian had become the welcomer, her orientation almost always shifting to acknowledge new arrivals. And the conversations, if that's what they were, appeared to have themes, topics that would dominate the group's attention for days at a time before shifting to something new. Sometimes they all seemed focused on the corner where we stored damaged merchandise, as if discussing what to do with items that could no longer fulfill their intended purpose. Other times their attention turned toward the door leading to the showroom, as if contemplating the lives of their colleagues in the main display area. I found myself looking forward to these discoveries, to the daily revelation of new relationships and evolving dynamics. The living customers in the main store began to seem less real, less interesting, than the silent figures conducting their patient social experiment in the room behind me. But the most unsettling realization came gradually, revealed through small observations accumulated over weeks of careful documentation. They were watching me too. It started with peripheral awareness, the sense of being observed that makes you turn around expecting to find someone looking at you. When I worked in the storage room now, organizing inventory or checking shipments, I could feel attention focused on me like a physical presence. Not hostile attention, not threatening, but certainly aware. And their positions began to shift in response to my presence. If I spent time working near the left wall, the next day I'd find several mannequins had adjusted their orientation to face that direction, as if they'd been interested in my activities. If I rearranged merchandise, they seemed to position themselves to have better views of the affected areas. They were learning my patterns, my habits, my rhythms. The way I moved through their space, the tasks that occupied my time, the routes I took between storage areas. And they were adjusting their own behavior, accordingly shifting their silent conversations to include commentary on my presence in their world. The idea should have been disturbing. It should have sent me running from the store, looking for another job, another life, somewhere far from mannequins and their impossible social dynamics. But instead, I found it oddly comforting. For the first time in months, I felt truly seen, truly acknowledged. Even if that acknowledgement came from beings that shouldn't have been capable of awareness at all. I began talking to them as I worked, offering quiet commentary on my tasks, sharing observations about the customers in the showroom, discussing the challenges of retail work. I didn't expect responses. I'm not completely delusional, but I found their presence soothing, their patient attention a relief after dealing with distracted customers and demanding supervisors. And perhaps it was my imagination, but their poses seemed to become more attentive when I spoke, more focused in my direction. Marilyn's head would tilt slightly toward me. Frederick would shift his weight, as if settling in to listen. Vivian would turn away from her corner observations to face me more directly. It was during one of these one-sided conversations that I made my most significant discovery. I was complaining about a particularly difficult customer, someone who had tried on dozens of items without purchasing anything, leaving the dressing rooms in chaos. As I spoke, I noticed that all the mannequins in the storage room had gradually reoriented themselves toward me, creating a semicircle of attention that felt remarkably like an audience. "You're lucky," I told them, folding returned merchandise. "You never have to deal with people like that. You get to stand here and have your quiet conversations without anyone making demands or asking impossible questions." It was then that I noticed the newest addition to our storage collection, a male mannequin we'd received just 2 days earlier. He was positioned apart from the others, still isolated, still undergoing what I'd come to think of as the integration process. But as I watched, he moved. Not the subtle, gradual adjustments I'd grown accustomed to. This was immediate, deliberate, unmistakable. He turned his head to look directly at me, a smooth rotation that brought his blank face into alignment with my own. The movement was purposeful, conscious, impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. We stared at each other for a long moment, the new mannequin and I, connected by a gaze that should not have been possible. His plastic features revealed nothing, but there was something in his posture, his orientation, that seemed to communicate understanding. Sympathy even. Slowly, carefully, he raised one hand in what could only be interpreted as a greeting. A welcome, an acknowledgement of my presence in their space, my participation in their secret social world. I should have been terrified. I should have screamed, run, called for help, done something rational and human and appropriate to the situation. Instead, I found myself raising my own hand in response, completing a gesture of greeting between species, between states of being, between the living and the impossible. "Hello," I whispered to the silent room, and though no voice answered me, I felt, for the first time in months, that I was not alone. Now, 3 weeks later, I've become a regular part of their nighttime society. I stay after closing, not to work, but to participate in their slow conversations, their patient social dynamics. I've learned to read their gestures, to interpret the subtle language of pose and position that allows them to communicate across the barriers of time and material. They've accepted me into their group, adjusting their configurations to include me. responding to my presence with the same gradual attention they show each other. When I arrive each evening, they shift slightly to acknowledge me. When I speak, they orient themselves to listen. When I work, they position themselves to observe without interfering. And I've begun to understand that their existence isn't limited to these after-hours gatherings. During business hours, when customers browse the showroom and I interact with the living world, part of my awareness remains connected to the storage room, to the patient figures conducting their slow, motion society behind the scenes. I know now that I am becoming something different, something between human and mannequin, between the quick urgency of living concerns and the patient deliberation of their eternal conversations. I can feel the change happening, not in my body, but in my perception, my sense of time, my understanding of what it means to communicate. The customers in the showroom seem increasingly hurried, increasingly frantic, their needs and demands as fleeting as their attention spans. But in the storage room, conversations unfold over days and weeks. Thoughts develop with the weight of considered reflection. Relationships evolve with the patience of geological time. I am learning to think at their pace, to communicate in their language of gesture and position. And with each passing day, the boundary between my world and theirs becomes thinner, more permeable, easier to cross. Tonight, as I prepare to lock up and join their evening gathering, I realize that the question is no longer whether mannequins can move, can think, can communicate. The question is whether I am still entirely human, or if I have begun the gradual transformation that will eventually make me one of them. The key turns in the lock with its familiar whisper. Click. A silence. The sound echoes through the store like an invitation, and I walk toward the storage room where patient figures wait to continue conversations that began before I arrived and will continue long after I am gone, or long after I have joined them permanently in their quiet, eternal dance of communication and connection. The boundary between observer and participant, between human and mannequin, grows thinner with each passing night. And I am no longer certain which side of that boundary I want to remain on. Story 8. The job at the monitoring station came at exactly the right time in my life, which is to say the worst possible time. My savings were running low. My apartment lease was up for renewal, and I needed something that would pay the bills without requiring much human interaction. 12. Our night shifts watching security feeds seemed perfect for someone who had grown tired of people, tired of small talk, tired of pretending that everything was fine. The facility was located on the outskirts of the city, a regional monitoring center that kept watch over dozens of unmanned gas stations scattered across 3 counties. Most of these stations had been converted to self-service years ago, reducing overhead and eliminating the need for overnight staff. My job was simple: watch the feeds, document any unusual activity, and call the appropriate authorities if necessary. The training was minimal. Gary, the day shift supervisor, showed me how to cycle through the cameras, how to zoom in on license plates, how to fill out incident reports. He was a heavy-set man with tired eyes, who seemed genuinely relieved to have someone take over the night shift. Mostly it's just people getting gas, he told me, settling me in front of the wall of monitors. Sometimes you get vandalism, sometimes theft. Kids being kids. Nothing you can't handle. He showed me the layout of Station 47, one of the newer installations on Highway 16. "This one's been acting up lately," he said, pointing to a cluster of screens showing different angles of the station. "Camera glitches, mostly. IT says it's probably interference from the radio towers nearby. If the feed cuts out, just log it and move on." The station looked typical enough, 6 pumps arranged in 2 rows. A small convenience store that had been permanently closed, bright overhead lighting that turned the concrete into a harsh white stage. The cameras provided coverage from multiple angles, wide shots of the entire lot, close-ups of each pump, views of the store entrance and the road approaches. My first few nights passed quietly. The usual parade of late night travelers stopped for fuel, long-haul truckers, shift workers heading home, teenagers on road trips. I learned to recognize the regulars, the nurse who always stopped at 20:17 a.m. after her hospital shift, the delivery driver who filled his van every Tuesday and Thursday, the elderly man who came by precisely at midnight in his vintage sedan. It was on my 4th night that I first noticed the anomaly. I was cycling through the feeds around 3 a.m. when I paused on Station 47. The lot was empty, which wasn't unusual for that time of night. But as I watched, something caught my attention at pump number 4. The nozzle was moving. Not much, just a slight swaying motion, as if touched by a breeze. But the night was still, and the other nozzles hung perfectly straight in their cradles. I zoomed in for a closer look and watched as the nozzle lifted itself from its resting position and began to extend toward where a car would be parked. There was no car. The nozzle moved with purpose, as if guided by an invisible hand. It positioned itself exactly where it would need to be inserted into a fuel tank, then remained there for several minutes. The pump's digital display lit up and began cycling through its usual sequence. Please pay first. Then, lift nozzle to begin. Then, select grade. I checked the other camera angles, thinking perhaps there was a vehicle I couldn't see from this particular view. But all the feeds showed the same thing. An empty lot with a single fuel nozzle suspended in mid-air, apparently filling nothing. The transaction lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I timed it. Then the nozzle smoothly returned to its cradle. The pump display cycled back to "Thank you," and everything returned to normal. I made a note in the log 3:17 a.m., Station 47, Pump 4 malfunction. Possible electrical issue. But even as I wrote it, I knew that what I had witnessed wasn't a malfunction. The movements had been too deliberate, too purposeful. Something had been there, something I couldn't see. The next night, I paid special attention to Station 47. I kept it on one of the main monitors and checked it every few minutes. At 3:16 a.m., I positioned my chair directly in front of the screen and watched. At exactly 3:17, it happened again. Pump number 4, same sequence. The nozzle lifted itself, positioned itself in empty air, and began dispensing fuel to nothing. This time, I noticed additional details. The overhead lights seemed to dim slightly during the transaction, as if drawing power from the same source. The security camera's timestamp flickered intermittently, jumping forward several seconds, then back, then forward again. And in the lower right corner of the screen, where the digital overlay showed pump status information, I could see that fuel was actually being dispensed. Gallons were being recorded, payment was being processed. Payment to what account? For what vehicle? I called Gary, but it went straight to voicemail. I checked the manual for protocols regarding equipment malfunctions, but there was nothing that covered invisible customers. The phenomenon continued every night, always at precisely 3:17 a.m., always at pump number 4. I began to document everything, the exact timing, the amount of fuel dispensed, the duration of each transaction. The amounts varied, sometimes 12 gallons, sometimes 8, once as many as 18. But the timing never changed. After 2 weeks, I decided to access the station's transaction records. It required calling the regional office and requesting special access, which I justified as investigating a possible billing error. The records confirmed what the cameras had shown every night at 3:17 a.m. Pump number 4 processed a legitimate transaction. Payment by credit card, account number partially obscured for privacy reasons. But here's what made my hands shake as I read the printout. The credit card belonged to David Morrison, age 34, of 142 Elm Street. According to the DMV records I was able to access, David Morrison had died in a car accident 6 months ago. His vehicle had been totaled in the crash. I stared at that information for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Dead men don't buy gasoline. Destroyed cars don't need fuel. Yet somehow, every night, David Morrison's credit card was being charged for gas at pump number 4. The next night, I arrived early and set up multiple cameras to record the 3:17 a.m. event. I wanted documentation, proof of what I was seeing. As the time approached, I watched all 6 feeds simultaneously, looking for any detail I might have missed. 3:17 a.m. arrived like clockwork. The nozzle at pump 4 began to move, lifting itself with that same purposeful motion. But this time, I saw something else. For just a moment, as the overhead lights dimmed and the timestamp flickered, I could see the outline of a car. Not clearly, more like a heat mirage, or the shadow of something that had been burned into the concrete. It was there for perhaps 2 seconds, just long enough for me to make out the general shape, a mid-size sedan, positioned exactly where the nozzle was extending. The phantom car. I rewound the recordings, played them back in slow motion, enhanced the contrast and brightness. But the effect didn't translate to the recordings. Whatever I had seen with my own eyes, the cameras couldn't capture it. After that night, I began to notice other details. The way the concrete at pump 4 seemed slightly darker than the surrounding pavement, as if stained by something. The fact that no real customers ever used pump 4 during my shifts, they always chose other pumps, even when 4 was the most convenient option. The subtle electric hum that seemed to emanate from that particular pump, just at the edge of hearing. I started researching David Morrison. Obituaries, social media profiles, news articles about the accident. He had been a software engineer, unmarried, no children. He lived alone in a small house about 15 miles from Station 47, according to the police report. He had been driving home from work when he lost control on a curve and collided with a tree. The accident occurred at 3:17 a.m., the same time his phantom car now stopped for fuel every night. I found myself arriving at work earlier each evening, spending more time watching that particular feed. I began to recognize the pattern of David's routine, how his invisible car would pull up to the pump at exactly the right angle, how the nozzle would move to exactly the right position, how long the transaction would take, based on how much fuel he was purchasing. It was during my 3rd week on the job that I saw him. Not clearly. Never clearly. But as the nozzle lifted itself that night, as the lights dimmed and the timestamp flickered, I caught a glimpse of movement near the pump. A shadow that moved like a person, gesturing like someone who was swiping a credit card, pressing buttons on the pump interface. I leaned forward, straining to see more. The shadow seemed to be wearing a suit dark, professional, the kind of thing someone might wear to an office job. It moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had stopped at this same pump hundreds of times. Someone who knew exactly which buttons to press, exactly how to hold the nozzle. Someone who was just trying to get home from work. The transaction completed, and the shadow faded. The nozzle returned to its cradle. The lights brightened. The timestamp stabilized, and David Morrison continued his commute 6 months after the road had killed him. I never reported what I was seeing. How could I? Who would believe that a dead man was stopping for gas every night, that his destroyed car still needed fuel for a journey? It would never complete. Instead, I simply watched, documenting the times and amounts, bearing witness to a routine that death itself couldn't break. Some nights, when the station was particularly quiet, I found myself talking to the empty lot. "Good evening, David," I would say as 3:17 approached. "Hope you're having a safe drive home." I like to think he could hear me somehow. In those moments when the lights dimmed and the timestamp flickered, when the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for a ghost to buy gasoline, maybe my voice reached him too. After all, everyone deserves a little human contact on their way home from work, even if they're 6 months late for dinner, even if the road they're traveling leads nowhere, but into the dark. Story 9. The rain against my window sounds like fingertips drumming against glass. It's been drumming for 3 days now, ever since Marcus moved in. I listen to it as I sip my coffee, watching steam curl up from the mug like smoke signals I can't decode. Marcus sits across from me at our small kitchen table, his own mug cradled between his palms. The ceramic makes tiny clicking sounds as his fingers adjust their grip, a nervous habit I've noticed in the week since he answered my roommate ad. The sound mingles with the rain, creating a rhythm that feels almost familiar. "Weird dream last night," he says, his voice cutting through the atmospheric percussion. His words hang in the air between us like morning fog. I nod, not really listening at first. The rain intensifies, each drop hitting the window with increasing urgency. Then something in his tone makes me focus. There's an edge to it, a tremor that matches the vibration in my chest I've been feeling since I woke up. "I was running," Marcus continues, staring into his coffee as if the dark liquid might reveal something important. Not jogging, not exercise running. Real running. Like when you're a kid and you hear footsteps behind you in the dark. My coffee cup pauses halfway to my lips. The porcelain rim feels cold against my skin. "There was this sound," he says, and I notice his breathing has changed, becoming shallow and quick, like breathing, but not quite right. Too deep, too slow, and I could feel something behind me, getting closer with each step. The rain stops. Just like that, the drumming ceases, leaving only the sound of our breathing and the subtle hum of the refrigerator. The silence feels heavier than the storm, pressing against my eardrums. "Marcus," I say, and my voice sounds strange in the sudden quiet. "What did the place look like?" "Where you were running." He looks up at me then, and I see something in his eyes that makes my stomach clench. Recognition. Fear. It was like a hallway, long and narrow. The walls were this weird beige color, and the carpet was that industrial kind, blue with those little geometric patterns. My coffee cup hits the table harder than I intended. The sound echoes in the small kitchen like a gunshot. "The fluorescent lights?" I whisper. "Were they flickering?" Marcus's face goes pale. "How do you?" "Every third one," I continue, my words coming faster now. Starting from the left, and there was this smell like cleaning products and something else, something organic. We stare at each other across the table. The refrigerator's hum grows louder, more insistent, until it sounds like a voice whispering in a language I almost understand. "I had the same dream," I tell him, though dream feels like the wrong word now. But I wasn't running. Marcus sets his mug down with trembling fingers. "What were you doing?" "I was chasing something." The memory floods back, sharper now, more real than it felt when I first woke up. Someone. I could hear footsteps ahead of me, always just around the next corner. Always just out of sight. The kitchen feels smaller suddenly, the walls pressing closer. I can smell something now, that same cleaning product scent from the dream. That wasn't a dream, seeping through the apartment's ventilation. "The breathing," Marcus says, his voice barely audible. "You could hear breathing. Deep and slow," I confirm. "Like something trying to breathe like a human, but not quite getting it right." Outside, the rain begins again, but softer this time, gentler. It sounds different now, less like fingers drumming, and more like whispers against the glass. Marcus stands up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. He paces to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass. I watch condensation form around his fingers, creating brief halos of moisture that fade as quickly as they appear. "This can't be happening," he murmurs to his reflection. "People don't share dreams. That's not how it works." But even as he says it, I can see he doesn't believe his own words. Neither do I. The dream felt too real, too specific, too perfectly interlocked with his experience for it to be coincidence. I close my eyes and try to remember more details. The sound of my footsteps on that strange carpet, muffled and rhythmic. The way the flickering lights cast moving shadows that seemed to wreathe along the walls like living things. The growing certainty that I was getting closer to whatever I was chasing, and the simultaneous dread that I might actually catch it. "Marcus," I say, opening my eyes. "In your dream, when you were running, did you ever look back?" He turns from the window, and I see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Once, near the end. "What did you see?" "Nothing." He shakes his head. "But there's something he's not telling me. I thought I saw nothing. But there was this presence. This feeling of being watched by something that understood me better than I understood myself. I feel a chill run down my spine, not from cold, but from recognition. It wasn't just watching, was it? It was learning. Marcus nods slowly, like it was studying the way I moved, the way I breathed, the rhythm of my panic. We fall silent again, each lost in our own thoughts, or perhaps the same thoughts. The rain continues its gentle whispers against the window, and I find myself listening for patterns, for meaning in the irregular percussion. There's something else, I say finally. Something I didn't tell you. Marcus returns to the table but doesn't sit. He leans against the back of his chair, knuckles white where he grips the wood. I wasn't just chasing something random, I continue. I was chasing you. The words hang between us like a physical presence. Marcus's breathing becomes audible again, quick and shallow. You knew it was me, he asks. Not at first, but toward the end, yes. I recognized the sound of your footsteps, the pattern of your breathing when you're afraid. I pause, studying his face. The same way you're breathing right now. Marcus sinks into his chair, as if his legs can no longer support him. This is impossible. We only met a week ago. I answered your ad on Craigslist. We're strangers. But are we? The question forms in my mind before I can stop it. I look at Marcus, really look at him, and try to remember our first meeting. He'd shown up at my door with references and first month's rent, exactly like any other potential roommate. But had there been something else? Some flicker of recognition, some sense of familiarity that I dismissed as wishful thinking. Tell me about the end of your dream, I say. What happened right before you woke up? Marcus runs his hands through his hair, a gesture that seems familiar in a way that makes my skin crawl. I turned a corner, and the hallway opened up into this room. It was circular, with doors all around the walls. Maybe 20 doors, maybe 30. I couldn't count them properly because they kept shifting, multiplying. My breath catches. What color were the doors? Red? Deep red? Like dried blood, but not gross, you know. Beautiful red. Inviting. And you could hear me behind you. Getting closer. Yes! He looks up at me with eyes that seem too wide, too knowing. But here's the thing I didn't understand until just now. I wanted you to catch me. The admission hangs in the air between us like a confession. Outside, the rain intensifies again. And I realize I can no longer distinguish between the sound of water against glass and the sound of my own pulse in my ears. In my version, I say carefully, when I finally caught up to you, you were standing in the center of that circular room. All those red doors were open, and through each one, I could see a different version of this moment. Different versions of us, having this same conversation. Marcus nods as if this makes perfect sense. And in some of those other rooms, you were the one being chased. Wes. And in others, we were both running. From what? I don't know. Marcus stands again, but this time he doesn't pace. He just stands very still, listening to something I can't hear. But I think it's catching up. The refrigerator's hum suddenly stops, leaving us in complete silence except for the rain. In that silence, I hear something else. Footsteps. Slow measured, coming from somewhere in the apartment. But that's impossible. We're on the 3rd floor. There's nowhere for footsteps to come from except the hallway. Marcus whispers. We both turn toward our apartment door. But the footsteps are clearer now, definitely coming from the building's hallway. They have a specific rhythm, a familiar cadence that makes my skin prickle with recognition. Step, pause, step, step, pause. That's how you run, I tell Marcus, though I don't remember learning this information. In the dream, that's exactly how your footsteps sounded. Marcus moves toward the door with the slow, dreamlike movements of a sleepwalker. "And that's how you chase," he says, patient, methodical, like you have all the time in the world. The footsteps stop directly outside our door. We wait, barely breathing, for what feels like hours but must be only seconds. Then comes the sound of breathing, deep and slow, just like in the dream. Just like Marcus described. The kind of breathing that's trying to be human, but not quite managing it. Should we open it? Marcus asks, his hand hovering over the deadbolt. I want to say no. Every instinct I have is screaming at me to step away from the door, to call the police, to do anything except engage with whatever is on the other side. But there's another part of me, a deeper part, that recognizes this moment as inevitable, as something we've been building toward since the day Marcus moved in. Maybe since long before that. In the dreams, I say slowly, "What happened after I caught you?" Marcus's hand remains frozen over the lock. I don't remember. I always woke up right before. Before what? Before we became the same person. The words should sound ridiculous, impossible, but they settle into my mind with the weight of absolute truth. I understand now why the dreams felt so real, so perfectly interlocked. We weren't sharing dreams. We were sharing an experience, viewing it from different angles like two cameras recording the same event. The breathing outside the door changes, becoming more rhythmic, more purposeful. It's no longer trying to sound human. It's revealing what it really is. And what it really is sounds remarkably like the combined rhythm of Marcus's breathing and mine when we're afraid. I think, I say, surprised by how calm my voice sounds. We need to open the door. Marcus nods, and I see acceptance in his expression. We both understand, on some level that exists below conscious thought, that this was always going to happen. The apartment, the roommate ad, the shared dreams. They were all just steps in a process that began long before either of us was aware of it. Marcus turns the deadbolt with a click that sounds like a decision being made. He opens the door. The hallway is empty, but the breathing continues, and now I realize it's coming from behind us, from inside the apartment. From the space between where Marcus stands and where I stand, as if something invisible is expanding to fill the gap between us. I look at Marcus, and he looks at me, and in his eyes I see my own understanding reflected back. We are the chaser and the chased, the hunter and the hunted, the dreamer and the dream. We have been circling each other in that impossible hallway not for one night, but for lifetimes, getting closer with each iteration until finally, inevitably, we occupy the same space. The breathing grows louder, more insistent, and I realize it's not coming from some invisible presence between us. It's coming from us. Our lungs, our rhythm, our shared need for air in this suddenly too small space. Marcus steps toward me, or I step toward him. The distance closes between us like a door swinging shut, and in that moment of contact, I understand that the chase is over. We have caught each other. The rain against the window sounds like applause, gentle and approving, as if the storm has been waiting for this resolution all along. In the kitchen behind us, the refrigerator hums back to life, a familiar sound that anchors us to reality even as reality itself shifts and changes around us. But which reality? The one where Marcus and I are roommates discussing shared dreams over morning coffee? Or the one where we're something else entirely, something that has been pretending to be two separate people, until the pretense was no longer necessary. I close my eyes and listen to our synchronized breathing, and I think I know the answer. But knowing and accepting are different things, and acceptance is a process that might take another lifetime to complete. Outside, the rain continues, patient and eternal, drumming its fingers against the glass of our shared world. Story 10. I hadn't spoken to Michael in almost 3 years when I decided to reach out to him last Tuesday evening. We'd been close friends through college and for a few years after. But life had pulled us in different directions. He'd moved to Portland for a job in software development. I'd stayed in Minneapolis to take over my father's accounting practice, and gradually our regular phone calls had dwindled to occasional social media likes and birthday messages. But something about the approaching anniversary of my mother's death had made me nostalgic for old friendships, for the kind of connection that exists before the world, teaches you to be careful with your heart. Michael had been there during the worst of her illness, had driven 3 hours just to sit with me in the hospital waiting room, had helped me sort through her belongings when I couldn't bear to touch them myself. If anyone would understand the particular grief that comes with anniversaries and empty chairs at holiday tables, it would be him. So I opened my laptop, navigated to my email client, and began typing subjecty, thinking of you, hey Michael. I know it's been way too long since we've talked, and I'm sorry about that. Life has a way of pulling you in so many directions that you forget to hold on to the things that matter most. I've been thinking about Mom's anniversary coming up, and it made me remember how much your friendship meant during that whole terrible time. I was wondering if we could maybe catch up sometime soon. I'd love to hear about how things are going with you in Portland, and honestly, I could use some of that perspective you always had. The way you could find meaning in the chaos when I couldn't see past the immediate crisis. Hope you and Sarah are doing well. Send her my love. Talk soon, I hope. David, I read it over twice, adjusting a word here and there, trying to strike the right balance between genuine emotion and the kind of casual tone that wouldn't make him feel obligated to respond if he'd moved on from our friendship. Finally, satisfied that I'd said what I needed to say without saying too much, I clicked send. The familiar whoosh sound of the email departing filled the quiet of my home office, and I felt that small sense of accomplishment that comes from finally doing something you've been putting off. I closed the laptop and went to the kitchen to make tea, already imagining Michael's response. Probably warm but cautious. Either way old friends are, when they're testing whether the foundation of connection is still solid after years of neglect. But when I returned to my desk 20 minutes later, cup of chamomile steaming beside my keyboard, there was already a new message in my inbox. Made my blood run cold, Rodri, thinking of you, from David Morrison. CPF mail. Com to David Morrison. CPF Gmail. Com sent Tuesday, March 15, 2024. 9:47 p.m. I stared at the screen, my rational mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The email was from my own address, sent to my own address, but the timestamp was 17 minutes after I'd sent the original message to Michael. I hadn't written any response. I hadn't been anywhere near my computer for the past 20 minutes. My hand trembling slightly, I clicked open the message, David. Don't send that email to Michael. Please. I know you think reaching out to him is the right thing to do, that it will help with the anniversary grief, but you're wrong. You're so terribly, tragically wrong. Michael died 4 months ago. A car accident on Highway 26. Coming back from a weekend at the coast with Sarah. She survived, but she's been in a coma since December. The doctors don't think she'll ever wake up. When your email arrives in his inbox tomorrow morning, it will be Sarah's sister who reads it. She's been managing his accounts, trying to deal with all the digital remnants of a life cut short. She'll see your message about Mom's anniversary, about wanting to reconnect, about sending love to Sarah, and it will destroy what little composure she's managed to maintain. She'll write back to tell you what happened. She'll try to be kind about it, but the words will cut through you like broken glass. She'll describe the accident, the funeral you never knew to attend, the way Sarah looks in her hospital bed, surrounded by machines that breathe for her. And then you'll spend the next 3 weeks drowning in guilt, wondering why you waited so long to reach out, why you let pride and procrastination prevent you from having one last conversation with one of the few people who truly understood you. You'll replay every moment of your friendship, every phone call you didn't return, every time you thought about calling but decided you were too busy, too tired, too caught up in your own small concerns. The grief you're trying to ease by reaching out to him will become 10 times worse. The anniversary of Mom's death will be forever tangled with the discovery of Michael's death, and you'll carry both losses together for the rest of your life. Delete the email, David. Don't send it. Find another way to deal with the anniversary. Call Dr. Peterson if you need to talk to someone. Take that trip you've been planning. Volunteer somewhere. Do anything except reach out to a dead man whose digital ghost will haunt you, with all the conversations you'll never have. I'm begging you from a timeline where I made the mistake you're about to make. Don't let curiosity convince you to send it anyway. Don't let the impossibility of this message make you think it's some kind of elaborate prank. I know you. I know you're sitting there, trying to rationalize this, trying to find logical explanations for how you could receive an email from yourself. There are no logical explanations. There's only the choice between making a terrible mistake and avoiding it. Please choose wisely. David's March 32nd, 2024. I pushed back from my desk so violently that my chair rolled into the bookshelf behind me, sending several volumes tumbling to the floor. The sound of their impact seemed impossibly loud in the silence of my house, but not loud enough to drown out the thundering of my heart or the rushing of blood in my ears. March 32nd. A date that didn't exist, couldn't exist. Signed by someone who claimed to be me writing from some impossible future, where my impulsive decision to reconnect with an old friend had led to devastating knowledge and unbearable regret. My first instinct was to check the message headers to look for evidence of spoofing or hacking, for some technical explanation that would restore my faith in the ordinary mechanics of cause and effect. But as I scrolled through the routing information, everything appeared legitimate. The message had originated from my own computer, sent through my own internet connection, using my own email client, with all the correct authentication protocols. It was as if I had somehow written and sent an email to myself from a future I hadn't yet experienced, warning myself about consequences I hadn't yet suffered, begging myself to avoid a mistake I hadn't yet made. I opened a new browser tab and searched for Michael's name combined with Portland and accident. For several agonizing minutes, the search results showed nothing but old social media posts and professional listings. No obituaries, no news reports, no digital evidence of the tragedy described in the impossible email. Relief flooded through me so intensely that I almost laughed out loud. It was a prank, had to be a prank, some elaborate joke, or perhaps a sophisticated phishing attempt designed to prey on emotional vulnerabilities. I'd been foolish to let it affect me so strongly. I would send my email to Michael. He would respond with news of his continued existence, and we would both laugh about my brief descent into paranoia. But as I moved the cursor toward the send button, something made me pause. What if the search results were incomplete? What if local news outlets hadn't yet picked up the story? Or if Michael's privacy settings prevented his accident from appearing in general search results? What if the timeline described in the warning email hadn't yet fully manifested in searchable digital records? I found myself caught in an impossible dilemma. If the warning email was legitimate, if some version of myself from an alternate timeline or future reality was trying to prevent a tragic mistake, then set in the message to Michael would set in motion a chain of events leading to devastating knowledge and lasting regret. But if it was a hoax or delusion, then failing to reach out would mean missing the chance to reconnect with a friend I genuinely missed, allowing fear and superstition to govern my decisions instead of love and loyalty. The cursor hovered over the send button as I wrestled with the implications. How do you choose between two realities when you can't know which one is true until after you've made the choice? How do you weigh the risk of causing harm against the risk of missing connection? How do you trust a message that claims to be from yourself when everything about it defies the fundamental rules of time and causality? I closed my laptop and walked to the kitchen, needing distance from the impossible decision. As I stood at the sink washing my teacup, I found myself thinking about the nature of regret, about the way our worst mistakes often look like reasonable decisions at the time we make them. Every choice carries the potential for unintended consequences. Every action ripples forward into futures we can't predict or control. But that's what makes choice meaningful, isn't it? The fact that we have to act without perfect knowledge, that we have to trust our best judgment, even when the stakes are impossibly high. If we could know the outcomes of every decision before we made them, if we could receive warnings from alternate versions of ourselves about the paths we shouldn't take, would choice itself become meaningless? I returned to my office and opened the laptop again. The warning email still sat in my inbox, its timestamp still showing that impossible future date, its urgent plea still echoing in the silence of my house. But next to it was the draft email to Michael, waiting patiently to be sent into whatever future my decision would create. For a long moment, I stared at both messages, the one I had written and the one that claimed to be written by me, trying to understand what they revealed about the nature of time, choice, and the invisible threads that connect our decisions to their consequences. Then, very deliberately, I highlighted the warning email and moved it to my spam folder, where it would be automatically deleted in 30 days. Some knowledge, I decided, is too dangerous to trust. Some warnings are too perfect to be real. And some choices have to be made without regard for the fears they might justify or the regrets they might generate. I clicked send on my email to Michael. The familiar whoosh sound filled the office again, carrying my words into whatever future they would help create. Within moments, my phone buzzed with a text message notification. With trembling fingers, I picked it up and read, "David! So good to hear from you! Was just thinking about you yesterday. Give me a call when you get a chance. Have some news to share." Relief flooded through me so completely that I had to sit down. Michael was alive, responsive, eager to reconnect. The warning email had been exactly what my rational mind had insisted it must be. An elaborate hoax, a psychological manipulation, a test of my ability to choose hope over fear in the face of impossible circumstances. But as I picked up my phone to call him, another email notification chimed from my laptop. The sound sent a cold spike of dread through my chest, and I turned to see a new message in my inbox. David Morrison, CPF Gmail, com ta. David Morrison, CPF Gmail, com, sent I Tuesday, March 15, 2024, 10:23 p.m. A subject. You should have listened. I didn't open it. I couldn't open it. Instead, I closed the laptop, turned off my phone, and walked outside into the cool night air, where the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the whisper of wind through the bare branches of the maple tree in my front yard. Sometimes the echo comes before the sound that creates it. Sometimes the future reaches back to warn us about the choices we haven't yet made. And sometimes we have to choose between the fear of unknown consequences and the courage to connect with the people we love, even when mysterious voices claiming to be our own future selves whisper warnings we can't bring ourselves to trust. I made my choice. Tomorrow, I'll learn what it cost me. But tonight, under the vast sky filled with stars that shine with light from years and decades and centuries ago, I'm choosing to believe that some echoes are worth the sounds that create them, and that reaching out to old friends, even when warned against it by impossible messages from impossible futures, is always better than letting love be governed by fear. The email waits unopened. Michael's phone number glows on my screen, and somewhere in the space between what I know and what I fear, the echo of tomorrow's regret whispers warnings I may not be brave enough to ignore much longer. Story 11. The bell above Hartwell's second. Hand Emporium gave a tired, metallic chime as I pushed through the door that Thursday afternoon. The sound lingered in the dusty air longer than it should have, as if the shop itself was reluctant to let any noise escape once it had entered. I'd been walking past this place for 3 years, watching it slowly empty as old Mr. Hartwell prepared for retirement, and something about the "everything must go" sign in the window had finally drawn me inside. For the shop smelled of old wood polish and forgotten memories. That particular scent that clings to objects that have outlived their original owners. Grandfather clocks ticked out of sync with each other, creating a polyrhythmic symphony that should have been chaotic, but somehow felt like a lullaby. I wandered through narrow aisles packed with the remnants of other people's lives, chipped teacups, faded photographs in tarnished frames, books with pages that whispered when I turned them. That's when I saw the refrigerator. It stood in the back corner like a mint, green monument to a more optimistic era, probably from the 1950s, with that rounded spaceship aesthetic that made household appliances look like they were designed for the future. The chrome handle still gleamed despite the dust, and something about its solid, dependable presence called to me. My own refrigerator had been making concerning noises lately. Grinding sounds that suggested mechanical death was imminent, and I'd been dreading the expense of replacement. That old Frigidaire. Mr. Hartwell's voice startled me from my examination. He emerged from behind a towering stack of cardboard boxes, wiping his hands on a rag that looked older than the refrigerator itself. Still runs like a dream. Compressors built like a tank. They don't make like that anymore. We negotiated a price that felt almost criminally low, and he arranged for delivery the next day. As I walked home, I found myself looking forward to the arrival of my new appliance with an enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to the purchase. There was something about that refrigerator, something that suggested it might bring more than just cold storage into my life. The delivery men struggled with the old Frigidaire's weight, cursing softly as they maneuvered it through my narrow kitchen doorway. Once they'd positioned it in the corner and departed with their tips, I stood alone with my acquisition, admiring the way its rounded edges caught the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window. I plugged it in, and it hummed to life with a deep, satisfied purr that seemed to resonate through the floorboards. The sound was different from modern appliances, richer, more substantial, as if the machine had a soul that had been quietly sleeping and was now content to wake up in a new home. The interior light flickered on when I opened the main compartment, revealing spotless white shelves and that distinctive smell of old refrigerators. Not unpleasant, just different. Metallic and clean, with undertones of something I couldn't quite identify. I transferred my milk and leftovers from the old unit, enjoying the spaciousness and the solid feel of the wire shelves. But it was when I opened the freezer compartment that I found them. An ice cube tray, the old aluminum kind with the lever that loosened the cubes, sat perfectly positioned in the center of the small freezer space. The tray was full, each compartment containing a perfectly formed ice cube that caught the dim freezer light like captured diamonds. I reached for the tray, intending to empty it and wash it, but stopped when my fingers made contact with the metal. The tray was warm. Not just room temperature, but actually warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight instead of a freezer. I pulled my hand back, confused, and checked the freezer's temperature. The dial was set correctly, and frost was beginning to form on the walls as it should. But that ice cube tray felt like it was radiating heat. Curious, I carefully lifted out one of the cubes. It felt cold in my fingers, solid and normal, but as I held it up to the light, I noticed something odd. The ice wasn't perfectly clear, as I'd initially thought. There were tiny imperfections inside, small bubbles or inclusions that seemed to move slightly when I shifted the cube in my palm. I set the cube on the kitchen counter and watched it. Minutes passed. The cube remained perfectly solid, showing no signs of melting, despite being in room temperature air that must have been 40 degrees warmer than its frozen state required. I poked it with my finger. Still solid, still cold, still perfectly intact. An hour later, I checked again. The ice cube sat exactly where I'd left it. Unchanged, undiminished, as if the laws of thermodynamics simply didn't apply to it. I picked it up, and it was still cold enough to numb my fingers. But the counter beneath it wasn't even damp. That evening, I became obsessed with those ice cubes. I took them out one by one, placing them around the kitchen, timing their melting, documenting their impossible persistence in defiance of basic physics. By midnight, 12 ice cubes sat arranged across my counters and table like cold sentinels, each one maintaining its crystalline integrity while everything around them radiated warmth. I found my magnifying glass in the junk drawer, the one I used for reading fine print on contracts, and began examining the cubes more closely. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. The inclusions weren't bubbles or imperfections in the ice. They were tiny figures, impossibly small but unmistakably human in form. Each cube contained what looked like dozens of minute people, their forms dark against the crystalline structure. And as I watched through the magnifying lens, I could swear they were moving. Not just shifting position, but actively moving, walking, running. Their minuscule arms and legs in constant motion, as if they were trapped in some kind of perpetual, frantic activity. My rational mind immediately rejected what I was seeing. It had to be an optical illusion, a trick of the light refracting through the ice crystals, creating patterns that my brain interpreted as familiar shapes. Pareidolia, the same psychological phenomenon that makes us see faces in clouds or figures in wood grain. But as I watched, one of the figures, if that's what they truly were, pressed what appeared to be tiny hands against the inner surface of the cube, their face turned upward as if looking directly at me through the magnifying glass. The mouth seemed to be open, as if screaming, though of course no sound could penetrate the frozen barrier that contained them. I set the magnifying glass down with trembling fingers and stepped away from the counter. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm, too close, despite the winter wind rattling the windows. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the corner, that deep, contented purr that had seemed so reassuring earlier, now sounding almost smug, as if it knew secrets I was only beginning to discover. Sleep was impossible that night. I found myself returning to the kitchen every hour, checking on the cubes, studying them through the magnifying glass, documenting my observations in a notebook I'd started keeping. The figures inside seemed more active at night, their movements more frantic, more desperate. Some appeared to be helping others, lifting fallen forms, or carrying those who could no longer move on their own. Others seemed to be building something, though what they could possibly construct in such a confined space was beyond my imagination. By morning, the ice cubes remained as solid and cold as ever, but something had changed. The figures inside seemed fewer, less active, as if whatever energy drove them had begun to fade. I found myself feeling oddly protective of them. These impossible beings trapped in their crystalline prisons, and I carefully returned each cube to the freezer tray, handling them with the reverence one might show to religious artifacts. Over the following weeks, I developed routines around the ice cubes. I would check on them morning and evening, documenting changes in their behavior, mapping the tiny worlds contained within each frozen prison. I bought a better magnifying glass, then a jeweler's loupe, then finally a small microscope that I set up permanently on the kitchen table. Under higher magnification, the details became heartbreakingly clear. The figures were definitely human in appearance, complete with tiny clothing. Individual faces, distinctive postures that suggested personality and emotion. I began to recognize individuals, giving them names based on their characteristics. The leader, who seemed to be directing the others' activities. The caregiver, who was always helping the injured or fallen. The builder, who never stopped working on what appeared to be some kind of structure in the center of their frozen world. But most disturbing was the watcher, a figure who stood always at the edge of the group, face turned upward, hands pressed against the ice barrier, mouth open in what I came to understand was a continuous, silent scream of recognition. The watcher knew I was there. The watcher was trying to communicate with me across the impossible barrier of physics and scale that separated us. I started leaving the cubes out longer, thinking that perhaps the warmth might somehow help them, might provide energy or comfort. But they never melted, never changed, never showed any sign that the external temperature affected them in any way. They existed in their own pocket of frozen time, subject to rules that made no sense in my reality, but seemed absolute within their crystalline confines. The worst part was the gradual realization that they were aging. Week by week, under the microscope's unforgiving magnification, I watched the tiny figures grow more stooped, move more slowly, help each other more frequently. The vibrant community, at first observed, was slowly dying, and there was nothing I could do to help them. I researched everything I could find about the old Frigidaire, tracking down its manufacturing history, its previous owners, any clues that might explain the impossible ice cubes. Mr. Hartwell had died just days after I bought the refrigerator. A stroke, the obituary said, so I couldn't ask him about its history. But I did discover that the appliance had belonged to a physicist named Dr. Eleanor Marsh, who had worked on some kind of classified government research in the 1960s, before disappearing without a trace. Her house had been sold, contents auctioned, and somehow the refrigerator had ended up in Hartwell's shop, carrying its impossible secret through decades of mundane ownership. I wondered if Dr. Marsh had known about the ice cubes, if she had been the one to first discover the tiny figures trapped in their frozen worlds. Late at night, I would sit in the kitchen with my microscope and notebook, watching the slow dance of life and death playing out in miniature, feeling like a god observing from an unreachable distance. But gods, presumably, have the power to intervene, to help, to change the fate of their subjects. I could only watch and document and try not to think too hard about the implications of what I was seeing. Because if these figures were real, if consciousness could exist at such a scale, trapped in such impossible circumstances, what did that say about reality itself? What other impossible things might be happening around us, too small or too strange for us to notice? What if consciousness was more fluid than we imagined, capable of existing in forms and places we'd never considered? And what if, somewhere in some unimaginably larger realm, giants with microscopes were watching us, documenting our struggles, our communities, our slow march toward an inevitable end, feeling the same helpless fascination that I felt as I watched my tiny frozen subjects. The ice cubes never melted. The figures inside grew older and fewer. My notebook filled with observations and sketches, and increasingly desperate theories about what I was witnessing. The refrigerator continued its contented humming, maintaining its impossible cargo of frozen life, indifferent to my growing obsession with its secrets. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet, and the only sounds were the refrigerator's purr and the scratch of my pen on paper, I would catch myself wondering what if I could join them. What if there was a way to shrink myself down, to enter those crystalline worlds, to help the watcher and the leader, and all the others in their slow struggle against entropy and despair. But then morning would come, and I would carefully return the cubes to their tray, close the freezer door, and try to pretend that the impossible wasn't sitting in my kitchen, humming contentedly in its mint, green housing, preserving mysteries that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of existence itself. The figures are still there, still moving in their slow, ancient dance, still building their impossible structures, still helping their fallen companions, still pressing their tiny hands against the frozen barriers that separate their world from mine. Still watching, still waiting, still trying to tell me something I'm not sure I'm ready to understand. A story 12. I've always found comfort in order. The soft whisper of pages turning, the gentle thud of books finding their proper homes, the satisfying click of my shoes against the polished library floor. These sounds have been my companions for 15 years now. My name is Marcus, and I am the head librarian at the Whitmore Public Library, a position I've held with quiet pride and unwavering dedication. The library closes at 8, and I always stay until 9, walking through each aisle, adjusting what needs adjusting, ensuring everything is precisely where it should be. Call it obsessive if you will, but there's something deeply soothing about the symmetry of properly aligned spines, the alphabetical harmony that speaks to my soul in ways human conversation never quite has. It was on a Tuesday evening in late autumn when I first noticed something unusual. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune overhead, casting their cool, steady glow across the fiction section. I was straightening the mystery novels when I placed a well-worn copy of Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, slightly out of alignment, just a millimeter or two beyond where it should rest. As I turned to move to the next shelf, I caught something in my peripheral vision. My shadow, cast long and dark against the opposite wall, seemed to pause. I stopped walking, curious, and watched as the shadow's arm extended toward the misplaced book. For a moment, I convinced myself it was merely a trick of the lighting, perhaps a passing cloud outside affecting the way the fluorescence bounced off the walls. But then I heard it. The soft scrape of paper against wood, the gentle thud of a book settling into its proper position. I turned around, my heart beginning to beat just a little faster, and found the Christie novel perfectly aligned with its neighbors, spine flush and orderly. The logical part of my mind, the part trained in the Dewey Decimal System and catalog management, immediately began formulating explanations. Perhaps the book had been balanced precariously and simply fell back into place. Perhaps the slight vibrations from the building's heating system had nudged it into alignment. Perhaps I hadn't actually misplaced it at all, and my tired eyes had simply imagined the disorder. But as I stood there in the quiet library, surrounded by the familiar scent of old paper and binding glue, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. But the silence seemed deeper somehow, more expectant, as if the books themselves were holding their breath. Over the following days, I found myself deliberately testing this phenomenon. Small things at first, placing a cookbook in the gardening section, sliding a biography just slightly out of its alphabetical order. Each time, I would turn away and listen, and each time, I would hear the soft sounds of correction, the whisper of pages, the gentle thud of proper placement, the satisfied sigh of order restored. And each time, when I turned back, my shadow would be just settling into its normal position, as if it had never moved at all. The discovery should have frightened me, but instead, I found it oddly comforting. My shadow, it seemed, shared my passion for organization, my need for things to be in their proper place. It was like having a silent partner in my nightly ritual of maintenance, someone who understood the importance of order in a chaotic world. But as the weeks passed, I noticed the corrections becoming more assertive. Books I was certain I had placed correctly would be found moved, reorganized according to some system I couldn't quite grasp. The poetry section, which I had always arranged alphabetically by author, was suddenly organized by publication date. The children's books were no longer sorted by age group, but by some intricate pattern based on the number of illustrations per page. I would work late into the evening, trying to understand the logic behind these changes, my fingers tracing the spines of books as I attempted to decipher the new organizational system my shadow seemed to prefer. The library had become our shared canvas, and I was no longer the sole artist. The really unsettling part wasn't the rearrangement itself, it was how right it felt. These new systems, these shadow-inspired organizations, made a kind of sense that went beyond my traditional training. Books seemed to call to each other across the aisles, creating conversations and connections I had never noticed before. The library began to feel alive in a way it never had, pulsing with invisible threads of meaning and association. But then came the night when I realized my shadow wasn't just correcting books. I was working late, as usual, when I knocked over my coffee mug. The ceramic shattered against the floor, dark liquid spreading across the tiles like spilled ink. As I knelt to clean up the mess, I noticed my shadow on the wall beside me. While I moved to gather the broken pieces, my shadow remained perfectly still, hands positioned as if holding an intact mug, drinking calmly from something that no longer existed. The silence in the library suddenly felt oppressive. The familiar sounds, the hum of fluorescence, the tick of the old clock by the circulation desk, the distant rumble of traffic outside, all seemed muffled, as if the very air had thickened around me. I could hear my own breathing, unnaturally loud, and the rapid beating of my heart echoing in my ears. I stood slowly, carefully, never taking my eyes off the wall where my shadow maintained its impossible posture. The shadow, Marcus continued its phantom drinking, tilting its head back slightly with each swallow, completely disconnected from my own movements. When I raised my hand to my face in confusion, My shadow lowered its arm to place the invisible mug on the invisible desk with a soft clink that I somehow heard despite the cup being nothing but fragments at my feet. That's when I understood my shadow wasn't just correcting the library's disorder. It was correcting reality's disorder. It was showing me how things should be, how things could be if only I had the wisdom to see beyond the limitations of the physical world. Night after night, I returned to study this phenomenon, this partnership between myself and my more orderly reflection. I would deliberately create small chaos, misplace books, spill water, knock over pencil holders, and watch as my shadow demonstrated the corrected version. The proper way things should exist in a world where order reigned supreme. But the shadow, Marcus, was becoming more independent, more insistent in its corrections. Sometimes I would find myself moving without conscious intention, my body following my shadow's lead as it guided books back to their proper places, straightened papers on my desk, aligned pencils in perfect parallel lines. The boundary between my will and my shadow's corrections began to blur, like watercolors running together on wet paper. The other librarians started commenting on my work. The organization has never been better. Mrs. Henderson from the children's section told me. It's like the books are finding their own perfect places. She laughed as she said it, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she had noticed the same impossible precision I had been witnessing. Young Timothy, our part-time weekend volunteer, mentioned seeing movement in the library after hours. Just shadows shifting around, he said with a nervous chuckle. Probably just the lights playing tricks, but it looked like someone was working late, rearranging things even after the building was locked up. I began to spend more time in the library, arriving earlier, staying later, drawn by an inexplicable need to witness every correction, every moment of perfect order being restored. My apartment felt wrong now, chaotic despite my best efforts to maintain the same level of organization. Only in the library, surrounded by the constant gentle sounds of my shadow's corrections, did I feel truly at peace. But peace, I was learning, could be its own kind of prison. One evening, as I was preparing to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My shadow, cast by the overhead lights, was moving independently not just of my current actions, but of my intended actions. While I stood perfectly still by the circulation desk, my shadow was walking through the stacks, methodically checking each shelf, making corrections I hadn't even noticed needed to be made. I followed my shadow's movements on the wall, watching as it pulled books I couldn't see, adjusted items that were already perfectly aligned from my perspective, organized according to rules that existed in some other dimension of order I was only beginning to glimpse. The soft sounds of its work filled the library, the whisper of pages, the gentle thud of spines against shelves, the satisfied sigh of completion. And then I realized with growing horror that I could no longer feel my own body moving. I was frozen in place, watching my shadow live independently while I remained a motionless observer of my own existence. The sensation was like trying to move in a dream, that terrible helplessness of a mind disconnected from its physical vessel. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. I couldn't tell. Before I felt control slowly return to my limbs. My shadow gradually synchronized with my movements again, but the message was clear. The corrections were no longer limited to books and objects. My shadow was correcting me, showing me the more perfect version of myself, the one who could achieve true organizational harmony. Now, as I stand here in the library each evening, I find myself moving in patterns I don't consciously choose, my hands reaching for books that don't need straightening, my feet carrying me to sections that are already perfectly arranged. My shadow and I have become dance partners in a choreography of order, and I'm no longer certain who is leading. The library has never been more perfectly organized. Every book rests in its ideal position. Every surface gleams with precise cleanliness. Every angle is measured to geometric perfection. Visitors comment on the almost supernatural level of organization, the way the space seems to arrange itself around their needs before they even know what they're looking for. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before closing, I catch glimpses of other shadows moving independently through the stacks. Shadows that belong to no living person. Shadows that continue the work of correction even when the building stands empty. I wonder if Mrs. Henderson's shadow rearranges the children's books according to its own perfect system. If Timothy's shadow volunteers even on nights when Timothy himself is nowhere to be seen. The library is becoming something more than a repository of books. It's becoming a place where the shadows of our better selves, our more organized selves, can exist freely, correcting not just the physical disorder around us, but the fundamental chaos of existence itself. And as I watch my shadow working tirelessly beside me, making corrections I never would have thought to make, I have to ask myself, in a world where our shadows can achieve perfect order, what need do we have for the messy, imperfect reality of our physical selves? The answer, I fear, grows clearer with each passing night, with each gentle correction, with each whispered sound of perfection being restored. Soon, perhaps, where the shadows won't need us at all. They'll have learned everything they need to know about creating order, and will become nothing more than the disorder they're trying to correct. But until then, I'll continue my nightly ritual, working alongside my shadow in our shared pursuit of perfect organization, listening to the soft sounds of correction, echoing through the quiet halls of the Whitmore Public Library, where the shadows have learned to work independently of the light. Story 13. The convenience store on Maple Street became part of my routine during the longest winter I can remember. I worked late at the law firm, often not leaving until well past midnight, and the little 24-hour shop was the only place still open where I could grab a coffee and something resembling dinner for the drive home. The store was one of those generic chain places that looked exactly like 1,000 others. Harsh fluorescent lighting, aisles of processed food, a coffee machine that perpetually needed cleaning, magazines and energy drinks by the register. But it was clean, well stocked, and importantly, it was on my route home through the empty streets of suburbia. The night clerk was a young man who couldn't have been much past 25. He was thin, pale, with dark hair that always looked like he'd just run his fingers through it. He wore the standard uniform polo shirt and maintained the kind of professional politeness that suggested he'd been trained well, but wasn't particularly invested in the job. What struck me most about him, from the very first night I stopped in, were his eyes. They were a pale blue, almost gray, and they never seemed to blink. Not never, I told myself initially. That would be impossible. I just wasn't noticing when he blinked. People blink so quickly, so automatically, that we rarely register it consciously. But as the weeks passed, and I became a regular customer, stopping in around the same time each night, I found myself paying attention to his eyes despite myself. I would enter the store, not a greeting, browse the aisles for my usual items, coffee, a sandwich, maybe a bag of chips, and all the while, I could feel his gaze following me. When I'd glance up, there he'd be, watching me with those pale, unblinking eyes. Not in a threatening way, just attentive, like he was studying me, cataloging my movements, learning my patterns. The first few times I approached the counter to pay, I tried making small talk. Comments about the weather, the late hour, the quality of the coffee. He would respond politely, even pleasantly, but his answers were always brief and somehow generic. Yes, it's cold tonight. The coffee is fresh. Have a good evening. And through every interaction, those eyes never closed. Not once. I began timing our conversations, trying to catch him in the act of blinking. 30 seconds, 40, 5 seconds. A full minute of steady eye contact while he rang up my purchases. My own eyes would start to water from the effort of not blinking, but his remained clear, focused, untroubled by dryness or fatigue. It became a kind of obsession, though I didn't admit that to myself at the time. I told myself I was simply observant, that I'd always been good at noticing details others missed. But the truth was that those unblinking eyes had gotten under my skin in a way I couldn't explain. I started varying my arrival time, sometimes coming in at 11:30, sometimes as late as 100 a.m. But he was always there, always at his post behind the counter, always watching with that same steady, unblinking gaze. No matter when I arrived, he looked exactly the same, not tired, not bored, not ready for his shift to end. Just present, alert, watching. After about a month of these late-night encounters, I decided to test a theory. I selected my usual items, but then pretended to be indecisive about the coffee, standing at the machine for several minutes while I stole glances at the clerk. He stood motionless behind the counter, hands resting on the surface, the eyes fixed on me. I counted under my breath. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of absolute stillness, his gaze never wavering, his eyelids never descending even for the fraction of a second it would take to blink. That's when I noticed something else. His chest wasn't moving. Not the regular rise and fall of breathing, but the complete stillness of someone holding their breath. But you can't hold your breath for 3 minutes and still look relaxed, comfortable, alert. I approached the counter with my items, studying his face more carefully than I ever had before. Up close, his skin had an odd quality, not pale exactly, but somehow translucent, like porcelain backlit by a gentle bulb. His hair, which I had assumed was simply dark, had an almost blue, black sheen under the fluorescent lights. "Just these tonight," I said, placing my items on the counter. "Of course," he replied, his voice pleasant and professional. His hands moved efficiently as he scanned the barcodes, and I noticed that his fingers were longer than they should have been, with joints that seemed to bend at slightly wrong angles. "Long shift?" I asked, still watching his eyes. "Not particularly," he said. "Time moves differently at night." It was the first thing he'd ever said that seemed like a real response rather than programmed politeness. I felt a small chill run down my spine. "How long have you been working here?" I pressed. He paused in his scanning, those pale eyes meeting mine directly. "How long have you been coming here?" The question caught me off guard. I realized I didn't have a good answer. "A few months, I think." "Since winter started." "Yes," he said, resuming his work. "Since winter started." He told me my total, and as I reached for my wallet, I made a deliberate effort to maintain eye contact. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, him waiting patiently for payment, me searching those pale blue depths for any sign of humanity, of normal human behavior. Still no blinking, not even the suggestion of it. I paid with exact change, counting out the bills and coins slowly, giving myself more time to observe. When I handed him the money, our fingers brushed briefly. His skin was cold, not just cool, but genuinely cold, like touching marble in winter. "Have a good evening," he said, the same words he always used. "You too," I replied, gathering my items. But as I reached the door, I turned back for one final look. He was still watching me, still perfectly motionless, still unblinking. And in that moment, with the harsh fluorescent light casting strange shadows across his too pale face, I could swear I saw something else behind those eyes. Not malevolence exactly, but a kind of ancient patience. The look of something that had been waiting a very long time for something specific to happen. I left quickly that night, but the image of his face stayed with me during the drive home. I found myself checking my rearview mirror more often than usual, half expecting to see those pale eyes reflected in the darkness behind me. The next few nights, I deliberately chose different routes home, avoiding Maple Street entirely. But my usual routine felt disrupted, incomplete without that final stop. I told myself it was just about the convenience, the coffee, the familiar rhythm of a late night purchase. But I knew it was more than that. The clerk had become a puzzle I needed to solve, a mystery that pulled at the edges of my consciousness. When I finally returned to the store, nearly a week later, everything looked exactly the same. Same fluorescent lighting, same arrangement of products, the same coffee machine humming in the corner. And there he was, behind the counter, in the exact position I remembered. Same pale skin, same dark hair, same unblinking eyes. "Good evening," he said as I entered, and his voice carried the faintest hint of satisfaction, as if he had been expecting me. This time, I decided to be more direct. I selected my items quickly and approached the counter with purpose. "I have to ask," I said as he began scanning my purchases. "Do you ever blink?" He paused, his hand stilling on the register. Those pale eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Do you?" he asked. The question was so unexpected that I actually laughed, a nervous sound that echoed strangely in the empty store. "Of course I blink. Everyone blinks. It's automatic, involuntary. Your eyes dry out if you don't." "Mine don't dry out," he said simply, resuming his scanning. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "That's medically impossible." "Many things are impossible," he agreed. Yet here we are. The casual way he said it, as if discussing the weather, sent another chill through me. I paid for my items in silence, but as he handed me the receipt, I couldn't help myself. "What are you?" I asked. He smiled then, for the first time since I'd been coming to the store. It was a pleasant smile, perfectly normal except for the fact that it never reached his eyes. Those remained as cold and unblinking as ever. "I'm the night clerk," he said. "I work here every night until dawn. And then what? Where do you go when your shift ends?" The smile faded. "I don't go anywhere." Something in his tone made me step backward toward the door. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm here every night until dawn," he repeated. "And then I'm not." I left the store quickly that night, but his words followed me home. "And then I'm not." What kind of answer was that? Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with solving the mystery. I started arriving at different times, trying to catch him during shift changes, trying to see who replaced him or who he replaced. But no matter when I came, 10 p.m., midnight, 2 a.m., he was always there, always in the same position, always watching with those unblinking eyes. I tried coming just before dawn, thinking I might see him leave or see his replacement arrive. But the store was closed then, lights off, doors locked. I peered through the windows and saw only darkness inside, no sign that anyone had ever been there. The next night, he was back in his usual position, as if he had materialized from thin air. I started researching the store, looking into its history, its employees, its overnight staffing policies. The corporate office confirmed that they employed night clerks at that location, but couldn't provide specific scheduling information due to privacy policies. When I asked about the pale young man with dark hair, they seemed confused, asking me to describe him more specifically. But how do you describe someone whose most distinctive feature is something they don't do? My visits became more frequent, my questions more pointed. I asked him about his background, his life outside work, his plans for the future. His answers were always polite, but somehow empty, like responses generated by a computer programmed to simulate conversation without understanding its meaning. "I've always worked nights," he would say, or "I don't have many interests outside work," or "I prefer the quiet hours." And always, those unblinking eyes watching me, cataloging my reactions, learning my patterns of behavior. It was on a particularly cold night in February that everything changed. I had arrived later than usual, nearly 2 a.m., and the store felt different somehow. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows between the aisles. The usual hum of refrigeration units was muted, making the space feel oddly muffled, like a room underwater. The clerk was in his usual position, but something about his posture seemed more relaxed, less rigidly professional. As I gathered my items, I noticed him following my movements not just with his eyes, but with subtle turns of his head, like a predator tracking prey. When I approached the counter, he didn't immediately begin scanning my purchases. Instead, he looked directly at me with those pale, the unblinking eyes and asked, "Why do you come here every night?" The question caught me completely off guard. It's convenient. It's on my way home. There are other stores on your route home," he said. "I've watched you drive past them to come here. A cold knot formed in my stomach." "You've watched me drive." "I watch everything," he said. "That's what I do. I watch and I wait." "Wait for what?" He smiled that same unsettling smile, for dawn. Something in his tone made me take a step backward. "What happens at dawn?" "I go away," he said, "until night comes again." "Where do you go?" His smile widened, and for the first time, I noticed that his teeth were too white, too perfect, like porcelain chips. "Nowhere," he said. "I just stop." The lights flickered then, just for a moment, and in that brief dimness, something changed about his face. The features seemed to blur, to lose definition, as if he was having trouble maintaining their consistency. "What are you?" I whispered. "I'm what happens," he said, "when someone stays too long in the fluorescent light. When someone works too many night shifts, drinks too much convenience store coffee, drives too many empty roads in the small hours of morning." The lights flickered again, longer this time. When they steadied, he looked normal again, but I could see the effort it took to maintain the appearance. "I'm what you become," he continued. "When you forget the difference between routine and ritual, between habit and haunting." I backed toward the door, my items forgotten on the counter. "I don't understand." "You will," he said. "You come here every night, same time, same purchases, same route home. You're learning the pattern. Soon, you won't need to think about it anymore. Soon, it will just be automatic. I can stop coming here," I said, my hand on the door handle. "Can you?" His pale eyes seemed to glow in the flickering light. "When was the last time you took a different route home? When was the last time you went straight home without stopping here first?" I tried to remember, but the nights blurred together in my memory. How long had I been coming here? Weeks, months. The winter seemed to stretch endlessly backward, an unbroken chain of late nights and convenience store stops. "The roads get lonely," he said softly. "The nights get long, and sometimes people need a place to stop, a routine to follow, a face to see in the fluorescent light. Even if that face doesn't blink, even if that face isn't quite real." I pushed through the door and ran to my car, my heart pounding. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror and saw him standing at the window, watching me go with those pale, unblinking eyes. I took a different route home that night, and the next night, and the night after that. But winter is long and habits are strong, and the roads do get lonely in the small hours of morning. Eventually, inevitably, I found myself back on Maple Street, pulling into the convenience store parking lot, walking through those familiar glass doors. He was waiting for me, exactly where he'd always been. "Welcome back," he said, and his smile was knowing, patient, eternal. I bought my coffee, my sandwich, my bag of chips, the same items I always bought. And as he rang up my purchase with those two long fingers, as he watched me with those never blinking eyes, I realized that he was right. It had become automatic. The routine had become ritual. The habit had become haunting. And somewhere between the fluorescent lights and the empty roads and the endless winter nights, I had started to become like him. Now I work the night shift too, in my own way. I drive the same roads, stop at the same places, see the same faces in the harsh, artificial light. And I wonder, sometimes, if I still blink as often as I used to, if I still remember what it feels like to be genuinely tired, if I still cast a shadow when I stand under the fluorescent lights. The clerk at the convenience store never asked these questions. He simply watched and waited and smiled that porcelain smile, because he knew that some routines, once established, are impossible to break. Some habits, once formed, last forever, and some night shifts never really end.